All right. So, as May said, we are here for the Small Profit Peers Accelerating Rural Eastern Kentucky um, um, session today. Hold on a second. And I hope that you are all staying safe in your areas. I know you guys are getting a lot of rain down there, and I hope you're all staying safe and as dry as possible, and that your communities are able to pull together through all of this. Our session today is called "In This Together: Trauma Impacts All of Us," and we're talking about trauma-informed approaches, how trauma lives in the body, that kind of thing. As I said, for those who were on earlier, this was originally supposed to be an in-person training. I've never done this actual training virtually before because of the sensitive nature of the topic, but we didn't want to miss getting started, so we are doing this virtually. So it's been modified. It may not take the full 3 hours since we don't have to build in breaks and activity time, that kind of thing. So just as an FYI, it's a little bit modified from the original format. The content's all there, but just kind of the flow and how we would normally operate are modified. Also, this presentation has been formatted for virtual audiences to be more accessible for participants with low vision. So the template that I use and the fonts and all the contrast and stuff I use are modified for people who have low or no vision to be able to follow along. First, thank you guys all. I think nonprofit work is the best work in the whole world. I always have. So I appreciate all of you being here, and I appreciate all of you taking the time to do it, especially given the weather you guys are having down there. And May's over in a coffee shop working. And so I appreciate you guys all taking the time out to be here today. A little bit about me, if you really want to know. I live in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm about 10 minutes from the Indy 500 Speedway. That's kind of the landmark that most people know in Indianapolis. May just sent me a direct message. I don't know why it is that way.
Yeah, I'm just, everyone, I'm just trying to see if we can get her main screen a little bit bigger because we can see her.
Is it showing like the big slide and small slide? That's the screen it's showing?
There's a big slide and there's a small slide disclaimer.
Let me see if this will do it.
That was straight. Yeah, thank you.
So I am from Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm about 10 minutes from the Speedway, and I graduated from Purdue. Sorry if anybody here hates Purdue. My mom had 3 degrees from IU, so I was not popular when I went to Purdue. I also went to St. Mary of the Woods College. That's where my master's is from. I've been working in a nonprofit for 20 years, aging myself a little bit there. I have professional experience with nearly all parts of nonprofit. I've worked in nonprofits as direct service, administration, community partnerships. I worked in the police department for a nonprofit in the police department here for about 8 or 9 years in executive leadership. I've worked with organizations from literal startup projects where we had $500 in a dream to national multi-million-dollar programs. And I really love what I do. I love helping people. I am now fortunate to be able to kind of pick and choose of who I want to work with and what missions are really called to me. So I'm excited to work with Spark and work with smaller nonprofits and helping them get where they need to go and achieve what they want to achieve. As a disclaimer, or what I call the "don't sue me" slide, I am not a mental health or medical professional by training, license, or credential. Today we're going to talk about practical information strategies around trauma and how to work with people with trauma and how trauma impacts us. It's not diagnostic. It's not a substitute for any kind of formalized mental health supports. You should not consider yourself able to diagnose people after watching this. So just as an FYI, I am a nonprofit person talking to other nonprofit professionals. I am not anybody who has a mental health credential. We're getting through all the bureaucracy parts here. This is a very significant trigger warning. We're talking about trauma. We're talking about how it impacts our bodies, how it impacts our brains, how it might look, how trauma responses might look. Depending on your level of trauma, because everybody has some level of trauma, this could be upsetting to you. This could be triggering to you. You might start to feel uncomfortable. Some examples might include abuse, addiction, violence, that kind of thing. You know, obviously you're all adults. Please take a break and take, you know, as you need, take care of yourself. You don't have to tell me that you're stepping away from your computer. I do not have built-in breaks into this because we are in a virtual environment, so people can just get up and kind of come and go as they need. But please take care of yourself. If you're starting to feel uncomfortable, if you're starting to feel, you know, anxious or upset, please just take a couple minutes and go do whatever and come back. That's fine. So today we are going to talk about what is trauma and how does it affect people, and the learning objectives there are just kind of increase the understanding of what trauma is on a practical level, how it impacts our bodies, how it impacts our brains, you know, what kind of reactions we are having when we are triggered by trauma, that kind of thing. What are trauma triggers and responses, and you know, what does that behavior look like? What do the reactions look like to trauma triggers? How do you get triggered? How might you, as a person who is seeing this happen, what kind of reactions or responses might you see that might indicate to you that someone has been triggered or someone is having a hard time? And then we'll talk about trauma-informed approaches to our work. I know all of you, some of you are doing direct service, some of you are doing kind of a mediation service of, you know, you're connecting people to other resources in the community. So it's important that we all have that information of how to do it. Also, you know, this can be applied to anywhere in your life. I think that learning about trauma, it helped me with like interpersonal communications. It helps you with your volunteers. It helps you with your board. It helps you with the cashier at the grocery store who's having a rough day. So it's really important that you guys and all of us kind of absorb the information about trauma and how it looks for everybody, not just us, especially at this point in our history. Also, if you have any questions during the workshop, please feel free to ask, drop them in the chat. You can also send them directly just to me if you want to, or you can send them and I can answer them later, or you can send them in the chat for everybody to see. Participation, I had this question earlier, is not required given the topic that we're talking about and given the fact that we're in a virtual environment. There are a few slides where I ask you for some examples that you might have that are just general examples, but I'm happy to answer questions, and at the end I will give you my email, so if you have questions that I didn't answer or that you didn't feel comfortable asking, you can always just shoot me an email and ask me any questions that you want to ask. So we'll get into it now. What is trauma and how does it affect people? So trauma has this lovely, very long and detailed explanation of what trauma is. But, you know, more simply put, again, back to practical, trauma is an experience that overwhelms someone's capacity to cope. And it is ubiquitous. 9 out of 10 adults in the US report experiencing trauma. And some traumas are on the scale of traumatic things kind of small. Some things are very big. Things such as natural disasters, and we'll get to some examples in the next slide. Or, you know, when you're a kid and you are in the hospital because you're sick for a week, like that can have some trauma as well. So, you know, there's different tolerance for trauma. And there's also different experience of trauma that make you feel a certain way. Everyone's tolerance is different, and everyone's reaction to that is different. A lot of that has to do with genetics. A lot of that has to do with brain chemistry. A lot of people, most people, cannot control how they react to trauma in terms of just their basic reaction. They can't control how it lives in their body. They can't control if it's what people might consider an overreaction or an underreaction or something like that. So it's important to realize that their capacity to cope, their nervous system, their parasympathetic system, all those things are overwhelmed. And then when you are triggered after you have a traumatic experience, your body feels like it's in that exact same situation again. So all those things start happening again. So here are some examples of trauma. And there are myriad examples of trauma. These are just some big ones. War, divorce, abuse, the pandemic. I mean, regardless of your opinions on the pandemic or how it's been handled or what could have been done or what should have been done, you know, it changed the way we live. And that was a group trauma that we all experienced together. Spiritual trauma. You know, if you were part of a church or other religious affiliation that treated you poorly or maybe had some kind of scandal in it, or, you know, you figure out that maybe at one point it was a cult, that kind of thing. Oppression, if you're part of a group that is oppressed by society, the government, anything like that. Medical trauma, people who have had surgeries or have been in treatment for a long time. or had some sort of physical trauma that, that kept them in the hospital, a traumatic brain injury or some sort of significant injury. Food insecurity. Food insecurity can live with you for a very long time. And poverty, natural disasters, also some of that are on here like fertility, all those kind of things, custody issues, any kind of, you're being sued by somebody for, that your house is in danger, that kind of thing. Can you think of any other examples of trauma that you see commonly in your work? And if you can, please drop them in the chat. This is one of those times where you're able to interact in a way that's not too, direct. But if you have examples that you see, racial trauma, absolutely, yes. Racial trauma is significant. Ethnic trauma as well is very significant. Addiction is significant. Environmental trauma, that's something that doesn't get talked a lot about, but yet absolutely. Loss of hope for the future. Everybody's kind of in this languishing phase right now, where we're just kind of all in this like, could it get any worse or probably will kind of feeling. That's kind of that loss of hope. Domestic violence and child abuse, that leaves long-lasting scars. Most of my background is in domestic violence and sexual violence. That's where I spent most of my professional career. Oh, you guys had a mass shooting in your small community. We actually had one last week in Indy as well, and I'm all here. And yeah, the mass shootings are on the news all the time. The 24-hour news cycle itself is a form of trauma for a lot of people, because all you hear is over and over and over again the same bad things happening. It's hard to feel safe. It's hard to feel regulated in that environment. So Kathy, my sincere condolences and thoughts are with you guys on the mass shooting, because that's just so destabilizing to everyone. And everyone thinks that you get desensitized to it, but it impacts people in ways that we don't even know. So childhood trauma, this presentation focuses on adult trauma for the most part, because childhood trauma could be its own separate session, right? It could be the way that their brains are still developing, the way it changes personality, the way it changes trajectory of whole lives is different than it is for adults. So most of the examples and discussions that we're going to have today are about adult unresolved trauma, but absolutely you can have childhood trauma. So the ACEs assessment, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, was developed as an assessment to connect health and well-being in adults with trauma from their childhood. This became very popular. It came out in 1995, which is over 25 years ago now. But it became very popular in the way in the mid-90s when people started to understand the weight of all of our childhood experiences. That's when you started to see a lot of criminal cases where the defense was, well, they were an abused child, they had poor background, or starting to understand the effects of things like a very contentious divorce on children, and food insecurity and poverty, and how that really impacts the rest of their life. So they started connecting that to adult behavior. However, now a lot of experts caution against giving the ACEs score too much weight. It's a great assessment, it's a great first step, but it also does not encompass our current understanding of trauma sources or how trauma works. It's not an incredibly nuanced way to understand trauma, but it does help kind of get that first step going, get that ball rolling. But it absolutely is not the definitive way that trauma is looked at for children. For instance, if you see on here, bullying is not a separate thing on here. So a lot of people, if you say, were you emotionally abused, you're going to say no. But if you say you're bullied, they might say yes. So it's a matter of being able to ask the questions that we know impact people now. I don't know that they'll do another ACEs, update to ACEs. This was a huge study that undertook with Kaiser Permanente. But again, it's a great tool to have. There are a million of them online if you ever want to use one. But just kind of take it in the totality of a person. One assessment's not going to take everything you need to know about another human. So there are trauma spectrums. And so we have an acute trauma. Acute trauma is a single limited event. So this might be a natural disaster. This could be a mass shooting if you're involved in a mass shooting. This could be a car accident. This could be anything that happens kind of one time and it's intensely traumatic in that moment. An example that a lot of people have for this is any kind of large disaster like 9/11. Like that was a very shared, mutual, one-time experience. People who were there is very acute. It's happening right now, and it will likely not happen again. Chronic trauma or is multiple traumatic exposures or events. So a lot of people who are in abusive relationships, have abusive childhoods, or have complex medical issues will have trauma over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. It's just happening to them all the time. People who live in poverty might experience trauma over and over and over and over again in different ways. Food insecurity, housing insecurity, you fall behind at school, having to leave education to go find a job to help support your family. People who are either themselves have addiction issues or live with somebody who has an addiction issue, those traumas can add up very quickly. Complex trauma is multiple traumatic events and impact of exposure to these events. So these are usually where chronic trauma is usually related to one issue that then causes all different kinds of trauma over and over and over again. But if the one issue were resolved, then the trauma may be reduced. Complex trauma usually means someone is being traumatized at different points by different events. So say that you are a person who is being raised by an abusive parent. And then at the age of 11, 12, 13, you experience a sexual assault. And then as a teenager, you are arrested by the criminal justice system and you're introduced into the juvenile criminal justice system. And then later you have a child who is very ill. Those are complex trauma because it builds on itself, but they are separate events. Obviously, they're all interrelated, but they're separate events. Secondary or vicarious trauma. This is exposure to trauma of others, whether that's a family member, a partner, people who live in close contact with a traumatized individual. However, now there is a very strong opinion that people who work in this field, like all of us, shouldn't call it vicarious trauma. It should be called workplace trauma because your work exposes you to the trauma. It's not like you have an option of just saying, no, not today, no traumatize people. You have to keep going. You have to keep going forward. So there's a whole discussion around that. But having somebody close in your life, whether it's professional or personal or social or whatever, who has a lot of trauma can be very upsetting for you to watch, very exhausting for you to deal with. It can also make you very angry on their behalf. We are much more, particularly in our part of the country, likely to get angry and upset on behalf of someone we care about more so than ourselves. We can manage how we're treated, but if we see someone we love being treated poorly, that becomes an issue that all of us just cannot tolerate, cannot sustain. Compassion stress. This is tied to vicarious trauma. The stress of helping or wanting to help a trauma survivor. You see somebody who just has a lot of things going on. You see that they're suffering. You see they're in trouble, and you want to help but don't know how. That causes its own level of stress. It causes its own kind of trauma, especially if you're seeing the same kind of problems over and over again, and the resources to help that problem, to mitigate that problem, just aren't there in your community. Housing is a really common one. People who work in housing have a lot of compassion stress because they're constantly scrambling to try to find more housing. Or shelter, emergency shelter space. Really, since the moratorium on rents went away, shelters have been full all over the country. So there's waiting lists to get into emergency shelters. So what do you do with people in the meantime? The last one is toxic stress. The last two are stress and not considered trauma because they are usually what you would consider smaller events over a sustained period of time. Toxic stress, these are things that happened. These are things like if you are in a job that you do not like or where you are mistreated, but you have to stay there because of your economic situation or insurance or whatever. Every day you go in and have that feeling of dread that you're walking in, it's just toxic stress. Or if you have a boss that yells at you constantly, it's toxic stress. If you are in an abusive relationship, it's every day that you're just trying to absorb what's going to happen. The other thing is these things can happen concurrently. There can be complex trauma and toxic stress. There can be an acute trauma, and then 10 years later, this person's working in social work, and now they are experiencing high levels of compassion stress or vicarious trauma. So these things all can happen concurrently or stand alone. You will meet the occasional person who's had one very large traumatic event in their life that has just changed their entire life and changed the way their brain works and changed the way their body reacts to trauma. You'll meet some people who have, very on a scale, very low trauma. They had just the trauma of growing up, and they've never had anything really bad, what a lot of people would perceive as bad, happen to them. The important thing to remember is, again, we don't get to choose what our initial reaction to trauma is. So something that seems highly acute and tragic may elicit a larger reaction from a person or a smaller reaction from a person. And objectively, when you're looking at it, you're thinking, look, your coworker had their house robbed and they were held at gunpoint, and you had a flat tire on the way to work today. What is your problem? It's really easy to do that. It's very easy. It's very normal. That's our first kind of instinct. But thinking about the fact that they have no control over, maybe when they were trying, for a lot of people, when I first got out of college too, a flat tire was a big problem because it meant no transportation to work. It was very expensive to fix. You had to figure it out. It's just one more thing to deal with. So thinking about how all that looks and how someone reacts is so usually outside of their consciousness, and how you react to them just feeds that information more in their brain. So the process of traumatization is the 3 E's of traumatization. Events, so direct or indirect exposure to an event, series of events, or circumstances. So that is the natural disaster, the abusive relationship, the divorce, the addiction, whatever that circumstance or event are. Then you experience it. So the event is internally interpreted as threatening, and it can be threatening physically, it can be threatening emotionally, socially, and creates a sense of helplessness or pain or distress. So sometimes, again, this event is internally interpreted this way. So even if 9 out of 10 people on the street would say that's no big deal, you need to move on, if your brain chemistry interprets it as threatening, it becomes a trauma. It becomes something that causes pain or upset or distress. One of the interesting things about this one is, the idea of socially threatening. There have been some court cases in the last probably 10 or 15 years where the defense has been based around they committed this crime because they were afraid of losing their social standing. They were afraid of being kicked off of this board. They were afraid, the privilege defense. They had this high social standing and high reputation that when it's threatened, they reacted this way. I'm not saying it's a valid defense. I'm not an attorney either, but it's something that's new in our kind of zeitgeist of working together. And then last, you have the effects. The exposure overwhelms your capacity to cope and has lasting impacts on us in a lot of different ways that people don't think about until they kind of start learning about trauma, even at a basic level of understanding what that looks like. So I have a couple slides in here that I call the real talk slides, based on doing this work for a while, getting the information, and kind of getting to those things that people either don't want to ask or they're sitting there thinking to themselves and So these are 2 things that I always get when I do this presentation in some form. First is, so if everyone has trauma, doesn't the word lose all meaning? And I think this is a very valid question. I think that it has a good point. Some people, the word trauma is overused. People say it all the time. It's become kind of one of those words that just kind of slips in, and people don't really think about what it actually means. So I talk about that in terms of, no, it hasn't lost all meaning. Yes, everyone has trauma, but everyone experiences trauma differently. There also is, there's a difference between experiencing trauma and being traumatized. A lot of our trauma, which we'll talk about throughout this thing, we process it and resolve it internally with no problem. Some of those things we cannot, we become traumatized. We also have different tolerances and reactions to trauma. Just because I went through something and you went through something that are very similar, our reactions could be completely different based on our backgrounds, based on our cultures, based on the support we were able to access, and just based on our body chemistry that we do not have any control over. So yes, everybody has trauma, but that doesn't mean anyone's trauma is less important than anybody else's. And so when we talk about things like big trauma, little trauma, bad trauma, acute trauma, trauma is trauma, and they're not all equal in terms of how you would expect people to react. But also, we don't know everybody's story, we don't know everybody's background. So the word doesn't lose all meaning, but I really do caution you to use the word traumatized when you mean traumatized. Use the word trauma when you mean trauma, and not use it casually in thinking about that. The other one I always get, especially from service providers, and this is a totally valid thing, is trauma an excuse for people to act however they want? Is trauma an excuse for bad behavior? Is trauma an excuse for being rude and aggressive and all these kind of things? Trauma is not an excuse, but it may be a reason. And it's important to understand the difference between an excuse, which is something that says, oh, you did this and it's okay because X, Y, and Z, and a reason, you did this because X, Y, and Z, and now let's figure out where to go from here. It is not an excuse, it's a reason. Understanding trauma is going to help you relate to people better, further your mission, reduce your own stress. Once you can kind of understand what trauma responses look like and behaviors look like, understanding how you respond, how your organization responds, can reduce a lot of stress, can reduce a lot of chaos. So it's very useful to do it. However, your safety and that of your staff and volunteers and clients is a top priority. So if you have somebody who has a highly complex trauma and may have a lot of reactions around that are violent, maybe they're aggressive, they're threatening, they're standing up, they're not adhering to the culture you've built, that may be a person that you can't serve. You don't have to keep serving them because they're traumatized. Your safety is paramount. Compassionate boundaries are absolutely a part of understanding trauma. Boundaries do not disappear in the face of trauma. People who are traumatized actually usually need help with boundaries and relearning boundaries. That's something that you change. Yes, we got some in the chat. Natural disasters are absolutely traumatic. Some of you are living in flood areas now. I mean, that is a traumatic thing to go through. Larger, wildfires, people whose house, it's just so random. It feels so random, right? I had a friend who lived in California, and she lived in like a little subdivision up near Malibu, and there were 8 houses. 6 of them burned to the ground. The other 4 were untouched, and the 6 weren't all in a row. It was like burned house, fine house, 2 burned houses, fine house, and it's just so chaotic, and it's hard to understand. So again, most of our traumas are resolved by the brain and body with little to no lasting impact. Our body understands what happened, our brain understands what happened, it was bad, we learn from it, and we keep moving. Other traumas require kind of formal interventions such as therapy, medication, and group counseling to process. What we're talking about in this session today is unresolved trauma. So that's trauma that is conscious or unconscious, that has physical, significant impacts on people. So people who either don't understand that trauma is why they're behaving somewhere, people who do not have resources to access any of these formal interventions, people who have been told for many years to get over it, just suck it up and drive on, or whatever other messaging they've received, people who are not in a space where they are ready to receive any kind of information about trauma, or people who have blocked out of trauma, people who had something very traumatic happen maybe as a child or early adulthood, and they just don't remember it. They don't remember the event, but the trauma lives in their body, the trauma lives in their brain. So that's what we're talking about today, is unresolved trauma for the most part. So trauma in the body causes hypervigilance. Hypervigilance means that you are always kind of on alert, that you are always ready to do something, especially when you're triggered. So if you look for these responses in yourself and others to gauge a potential trauma response, your pupils are going to dilate, your heart's going to beat faster, blood pressure increases, blood flow to muscle increases. Blood flow to muscle increases, obviously, it's hard to see that in other people, but you can kind of see that because they'll get up and start walking around. They'll start fidgeting. They'll start maybe cracking their knuckles. They'll start flexing their arms because blood flow is increasing to their muscles. Their breathing rate increases. They get very upset. Can you guys think of any other potential physical responses caused by trauma? Outward physical responses, things that you might be able to see in another person. You can put them in the chat. Something else you might see is people who have compulsive behaviors with their bodies. So that maybe they pull their hair, they pick at their skin, panic attacks, yes. People who look drained, people who kind of have that flat affect, skin issues, sallow. Again, they might be picking at their skin. They might have a compulsion to do that. A lot of repetitive behaviors with the body, unable to settle down. They want to stand up, they want to walk around, they want to. They don't want to sit down and have a conversation. They find it hard to maintain eye contact, not just because of what their brain chemistry, but also their pupils dilating to make their vision wider to see what's going to happen. Headache and nausea, absolutely. A lot of times, especially when I was doing direct service with domestic violence survivors, when they would tell us their story, they would, they'd say my stomach started to hurt. I feel like I'm going to be sick, out of nowhere, and so you have to stop and kind of walk that back. But those are all physical responses outwardly that you might see from other people. Stimming, absolutely. People who don't know what stimming are, it's behaviors that people undertake to reduce or process the stimulus that's coming from the outside. Some people will cover their ears. Some people will, they'll fidget with their hands. Some people, it's repetitive behavior. So you'll see those kind of things with people who are being triggered. You also might, sudden movements, they hear a noise and they're jerking their head. It's very jerky, kind of sudden movements. It can even cause nosebleeds out of nowhere. I mean, people who are triggered, your body will just react in a way that it needs to react. It's going to come out and be in there somehow. So you have three primary hormones that are used to process stress that are impacted by trauma. So cortisol is our hormone that keeps us wide-eyed and alert. So when you are, maybe you are camping and you hear a noise out in the woods. And so that feeling of looking around to see what it is, evaluating your surroundings, trying to figure out what's going on, in that kind of gut instinct that we all call that, of like something's wrong, hair on the back of your neck stinging up, that's all cortisol. Adrenaline is used in response to stress to activate fight or flight, which we'll get into in a little bit. Obviously, adrenaline has other uses, but in terms of trauma, it's that flight or fight activation that really causes a lot of issues. Outburst is another really great example of somebody you're talking to. It's in the chat. Somebody you're talking to and everything's going really great, and all of a sudden, to you, it seems like it's just gone off the rails for no reason that you can understand. And then oxytocin is the love hormone that promotes relationships and social connections. So these three things are part of the, brace yourselves, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. No one's going to expect you to remember that. There's not going to be a quiz later. It's HPA is the short term for it. That's your central stress response system. That's kind of when your nervous system and your endocrine system come together for this axis. And that's where these three things live. So what trauma does is it creates an overproduction of cortisol and adrenaline. It makes you more reactive. It increases these stress hormones for things that are not necessarily stressful in an objective way. However, chronic overproduction of cortisol and adrenaline increases anxiety, it increases depression, heart disease, sleep disruption, and memory damage. It also impacts weight, but it impacts weight in different ways. Some people, their overproduction will cause unwanted weight gain. Some people will cause unwanted weight loss in a way that can't be controlled, in a way that is unhealthy. Trauma, however, people don't know this a lot, it actually reduces your ability to release oxytocin, which decreases your physical and emotional adaptability and your ability to connect with others and connect to yourself. That's why you get a lot of trauma survivors who will say, I'm feeling very disconnected, I don't feel connected to anything. Somebody had said feeling of hopelessness earlier in the chat, that languishing feeling. That's due to a prolonged reduction of oxytocin. That also impacts your ability to connect to your children if you have children. It impacts your ability to switch course very quickly. It impacts all those things that make you feel loved and connected. And that reduces over time. And it's hard to start producing that again if you are living in unresolved trauma. So trauma in the brain, obviously there are a gazillion more parts of the brain, but we're going to just talk about the three that really are relevant to trauma. So if you look at the brain from the side, view like this, the top part, I don't think you can see my mouse. This part here, the top part, is what we call kind of the thinking part of your brain. That's your executive function, that's choices, that's feelings, that's memories, that's all those kind of things. The bottom part down here, hippocampus and amygdala and those kind of areas, and down here in the brainstem, that's kind of your primal part of your brain. That's breathing, that's respiration, that is what people call lizard brain. Things that would have kept us safe in hunting and gathering days, things that would have kept us alive. Their job is to keep us alive. That's what those three things do. So you have bottom brain thinking, which is survival. It's based in survival. And you have top brain thinking, which is reasoning, critical thought, emotions, feelings, all those kind of things. So when you are experiencing trauma, whether during the actual event you're experiencing trauma or as a trigger after trauma, your bottom brain is what gets engaged. So your prefrontal cortex, which is this lovely green part here, that's what manages your thoughts, behavior, emotional regulations. This is kind of the transition from bottom brain to top brain, and it shrinks over time. It physically shrinks over time due to unresolved trauma. And again, trauma is not always irreversible. It's usually not irreversible with assistance and that kind of thing. But your prefrontal cortex in that time period will shrink. So your thoughts and behavior and emotional regulation abilities also shrink. They're getting smaller. Your hippocampus, which assists in learning and memory storage relative to safety and danger. This is what helps calm the amygdala, which we'll get to in a minute. It also shrinks over time. So now you have shrunk the physical part of your brain that manages thoughts, behavior, and emotional regulation. We've also shrunk the part of our brain that remembers how to feel and be safe, and also all that kind of muscle memory around that. And then we get to the amygdala. The amygdala is kind of the middle part of your brain that has kept you alive your whole life in terms of safety and survival and this kind of things. It acts as an alarm for stressful events and danger. So this is the, again, hair on the back of your neck, gut instinct, something's wrong, wake up in the middle of the night and try to figure out if you woke up because you heard noise, someone in your house. That's all amygdala. Over time, this becomes overactive. So the amygdala is signaling all the time, something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong. Meanwhile, your prefrontal cortex and hippocampus are shrinking, so they can't override the amygdala and calm it down and say, no, I get what you're saying, but no, we're fine. Everything's fine. We're in our house. We're safe, or wherever this is. So there are also other parts of the brain, but the other thing is that trauma can significantly alter the neuroplasticity of your brain. Neuroplasticity of our brain is our ability to modify, change, and adapt. Both our physical structure of our brain and the functionality, the electricity that's in our brain throughout the life in response to experiences. So somebody who maybe has a traumatic brain injury will have a completely different personality sometimes after the injury. People who experience trauma that's unresolved can change drastically because their physical brain is changing, the function of their brain is changing. Again, the younger the person is exposed to trauma, the more likely they are to have significant changes because their brain is still developing. And without intervention, some changes can be permanent. However, it's important to remember that these processes are automatic and operate mostly outside of our consciousness. It's not like I'm a traumatized person that thinks about my hippocampus shrinking. These things are happening moment to moment and incrementally. So a person who is traumatized with unresolved trauma can't necessarily control a lot of this. That's what a lot of formal interventions do, is help you understand that a lot of it is not your fault, to use that term, but happening in your brain and figuring out ways to cope with that. Here's the other part of this is while all this is happening, amygdala is going nuts, hippocampus and prefrontal cortex are shrinking, your brain's like any other muscle. The parts that you use the most get stronger and faster. So the amygdala responses are getting stronger and faster. That's how trauma responses get hardwired into your brain. It's like anything else. If we use the amygdala the most, it becomes the strongest, the fastest, and the most dominant. So trying to introduce reactions and approaches and those kind of things that help soothe that amygdala response, that help soothe those limbic system responses. So when you're triggered by past trauma, your brain a lot of times will react the same way it did when the trauma was actually happening. The kind of thought is this reaction kept us alive last time, so it'll probably work again, even though the trauma is not actually happening. There's a trigger, which we'll talk about triggers in just a couple minutes. But the trauma, it feels the same to your brain. It feels the same as when it happened. So you lose your prefrontal regulation, shuts down the pre-cortex. Bottom up attention, meaning again, bottom of the brain, survival is what your brain is thinking. Survival, survivor, survival. How are we gonna react to this? It's automatically captured by anything as dangerous or perceiving as dangerous and threatening, and it's focused on survival. That's activated immediately. So now prefrontal cortex and hippocampus are no longer even in the game. It's all going to be amygdala responses in these triggering moments. And then emotional reflexes are automatic. Fight, flight, freeze, and a couple more we'll talk about in a little bit. Also, those things like your heart pounding. Some people know that they are going to have a trauma-induced panic attack or anxiety attack because their heart starts pounding first, or their start sweating. And they know that all this other stuff is coming later because your amygdala is pumping out these hormones. Hey, we have to be able to respond, get the adrenaline going, get the cortisol going. This is not the place for oxytocin, for touchy-feely, let's think it through. This is not the place for executive function. We have to stay alive. So usually the physical reaction will happen first, and then we start having all these other internal reactions of anxiety, of all the examples that you guys gave. There are significant risks of unresolved trauma. I'm assuming most of you know that at this point in the presentation, but they're myriad and they are life-changing, and some of them can even be deadly. Increased likelihood for addiction, increased risky sexual behaviors. So your increased risk to exposure to STIs and HIV and those kind of things. More likely to miss work, more likely to experience depression, suicide. Suicide is very common with people who have a high level of unresolved trauma. If you think about a lot of veterans, and suicide rates are kind of, they've been studied for a long time and they're very high. Veterans, by the nature of their experience, have experienced trauma, so they have experienced high amounts of intense trauma. They're more likely to smoke. It's hard for them to keep a job. It's hard for them to commit to things. It's hard for them to access resources. It's harder for them to raise children. It's harder for them to stay in a relationship. Also, as an aside, I realize that committing suicide is not the correct parlance, but I think this visual is very good, and it's not mine, so I can't change it. But I understand that commit suicide is not the appropriate term that people use. But I wanted to keep this visual in here. I actually have asked the place that produces this to change the wording, but it hasn't happened yet. So the other thing is trauma can be exponential. So trauma doesn't just necessarily impact the person experiencing trauma. For instance, trauma can negatively impact a person's ability to properly parent, which then traumatizes that child because the parent maybe can't work, so there's not food. Maybe the parent becomes abusive. Maybe the parent has an addiction issue. All of those things trickle down to their children. The example here is probably parent, but also it can be, you were improperly parented and that was your trauma. So you may be the child in this situation too. Intergenerational trauma is further exacerbated by historical trauma. Historical trauma is experienced by a specific cultural, ethnic, racial group that has a history of being systematically oppressed or endangered. Someone mentioned racial trauma. This is part of the historical trauma. Historical trauma has been documented in lots of groups: slaves, Native Americans, Indigenous Americans, war survivors, refugees. One of the examples that has been documented was a study in Canada where they were studying, this was in the 60s and 70s, they were studying who was accessing mental health care. And they found that grandchildren of Holocaust survivors were overrepresented by 300% in psychiatric clinics than the general population. Not even just compared to other grandchildren of people who were involved in World War II. Of the general population, 300%. And that study, looking at those records and that kind of thing, that study kind of indicated this inherited historical trauma of oppression and violence and, being forced to move and being persecuted. Those were all things that were not necessarily experienced firsthand by these grandchildren, but they felt that. They felt the presence of that. There's also some information around, in terms of American history, the lower outcomes of pregnant Black women has been related to historical trauma. The way that their body reacts to being pregnant, the way that pregnancy is perceived, is all a result of historical trauma, of the joy of having a child, but worrying about how their life is going to turn out. Worried about how the world is going to shift and change and treat them as a person. That's all part of historical trauma. Recently, science, by recently, I mean like the last probably 10, 15 years, which is recent for science, exploring the idea that intergenerational and historical trauma may also impact epigenetics. So epigenetics are kind of a fascinating field where our DNA sequences are the same for a certain thing, but the body reads those sequences differently. The body interprets those things differently. They think it may have a role in stress hormone regulation and addiction. They think some of this predisposition to addiction comes from your genetic code, right? Your DNA hasn't changed, but the way your body, your brain sees that code is different. Epigenetics. Epigenetics are also changeable. They can change over time. They're not really fully understood, but there is strong evidence that are very, very related and very relevant to trauma experiences and to trauma overall. So it's important to understand that resolving trauma and helping people resolve their trauma or even identify trauma, it benefits more than just that person. It benefits their partners, their children, their parents, their coworkers, their larger ethnic, cultural, racial group. So it's important to realize how trauma impacts everybody. A good example of historical trauma also recently has been, and it doesn't matter which side or your opinion on it, the overturning of Roe v. Wade. There are a lot of women who are very triggered by that, even if they've never had to have any kind of services around that for abortion or contraception or anything like that. They were triggered by it because it called into the question of their personhood. So regardless of what their personal opinion was on that ruling or on abortion access, the ruling that impacted an entire gender identity group of people caused people to feel a way they didn't think they were going to feel. And there's been a lot of really good articles written about that so far. I'm sure there'll be more to come in the future. But it caused a lot of reaction that people didn't expect, I don't think. So what are trauma triggers and responses? Trauma trigger is basically anything that reminds somebody of what happened right before or during the traumatic experience. Triggers are often, but not always, connected to our senses. Sight, what did you see? You see something that reminds you of it. A sound. Sounds are very, very powerful in good ways and bad ways. So if you have a song that reminds you of a good time in your life and you think it's great and you smile when you hear it, that's fantastic. But also sounds can embed in your brain and connect you to a bad time in your life. Smell. Sound and smell are some of the things that encode deeply in our memories. Again, in good ways and bad ways. For instance, when I smell fresh cut grass, it always reminds me of my dad because my dad's one of those lawn obsessed people. And now that he's retired, it's gotten worse. But that always reminds me of my dad. It's a good association. Fresh cut grass reminds me of my dad. But smells that remind you of something bad that happened. For instance, I had a friend who was in a car accident, and she was in a car accident with a truck that was doing roofing. So that kind of smell of tar, she can't sustain that now. When they redid her roof at her house, she actually went to a hotel while it was done. The smell of it, even on a warm day, when you can smell the asphalt tar on the ground, is very hard for her. Taste. You taste something that reminds you. So that Marcel Proust wrote one of the world's longest books, Remembrances of Childhood, and he actually got that from eating a mandolin cookie. He ate it and it unlocked his entire childhood that he blocked out. It's a very boring book in my opinion. It's a classical read, but that's one of the examples they give. Touch. So what something feels like, or how it touches, or consistency are a big thing. Soft, hard, rough. When I was working in sexual violence, we had a lot of people who would say they couldn't stand the feel of whiskers. Like if they were touching someone's face that had whiskers, or touching, if they were a person who shaved their legs, touching their legs when they had stubble on them, because their assailant, they were trying to fight them off, and they remember the feel of the whiskers on their fingers. Those are things we don't always think about. Triggers may also be the memory of the feeling. So if you felt afraid or if you felt threatened during the trauma, and then you feel threatened or afraid by something that's completely unrelated to that actual traumatic event, your trigger can be the same because the feeling's the same. So your body's like, oh, what did we do last time? Oh, we did this. It doesn't matter what the event actually is. If that feeling's the same and it's unresolved, it might trigger it as well. Triggers can be conscious or unconscious. Some people are very aware of what triggers them. As I shared my friend with the tar, she doesn't go around tar, tries to avoid it. Some are unconscious. They don't know what made them uncomfortable. They don't know what made them upset. They don't know what makes them anxious. But learning triggers is really a great way to help kind of keep yourself regulated, to help other people keep themselves regulated. So if you're in therapy, a therapist might try to peel that back. Okay, you had an outburst at work and you were upset and you were crying. What happened right before that? Okay, the last time we talked about having one of these outbursts, you said you were doing this. What are the commonalities there? So looking for those kind of things so people can help identify their triggers and avoid them or mitigate them or address them, depending on what they are. For people who have joined more recently, I am putting the link back in the chat, because sometimes you can't scroll back up to the chat. Actually, I just went to May. I'm sorry. I also sent to everybody in the meeting. This is a link to my Google Drive folder that has some materials related to trauma-informed care and also a copy of these slides. So if you're new here, welcome. And please go ahead and go to the Google Drive when you get a chance if you want to see this, have a copy of the slides and stuff like that. So there are two kinds of triggers, internal triggers. Those are things that happen kind of in your body. So memories, feelings, emotions, you start to feel angry or anxious, you start to feel abandoned, feelings of frustration, memories, pain or muscle tension. Those are all remind your brain of how you felt during the actual trauma. Those will all remind your brain, what did we do when this happened last time? And what should we do now? And usually that reaction is much bigger than you need in a situation where you are not in the traumatic experience. There are also external triggers, things that happen outside of your body that recall those feelings, like anniversaries of a trauma. I know every year on 9/11, every news outlet in America does, so here we are 20 years later, here we are 15 years later, here we are, and they show the videos and they show all the things. Same thing with kind of the Oklahoma City bombing. A lot of local communities have traumas that are marked by anniversary. It's been 15 years since such tornado or flooding or whatever, and so it keeps coming up over and over again. Seeing a person connected to the traumatic event. This is somebody that, so it can kind of go two ways. One, you can make a trauma bond with a person who experienced it with you, or that person is just triggering for you and you can't be around them. We had this happen with a lot of police officers when I worked in the police department. They would, and I understand that seeing police officers could be triggering people unrelated to a traumatic event, but we would have detectives who helped on like a domestic violence case or a homicide case or a sexual violence case, and seeing that detective later in court or even at a community event they happened to be at was very traumatic for victims and victims' families. Of seeing that person, even though that person maybe helped bring justice to that situation, it was hard for them to see and hard for them to hear that person. Smells or sounds, again, that's a very triggering thing. A friend of mine actually works for the state fair here in Indianapolis. She has for years and years, and she said they have a higher number than you would think of people who are triggered by a fair experience. Like a midway, the midway sounds and smells, the funnel cakes and all the music, and come over here and win a stuffed animal, that kind of stuff. And their medical team at the state fairgrounds responds to a lot of panic attacks and a lot of anxiety attacks. Some of those obviously are related to people who have anxiety disorders, but some of them are related to trauma. And they'll say, when I came to the fair when I was a little kid, I was assaulted, or I couldn't afford to bring my kids to the fair. And it was embarrassing for them, and all these kind of things, or the smell of grease for like the funnel cakes. I was burned by grease, or whatever. There's it's just an overwhelming experience for a lot of people. A television show or movie that reminds you of the traumatic event. So there's always we have so much true crime, access to true crime and mysteries and that kind of thing, that if your story sounds like that story, it can be very upsetting. It can be very triggering to you, and you don't have any way to know. Or when you take your kids to the movies, sometimes, for instance, I have a family member who took her kids to see a movie right soon after her parent died, and in the movie the parents died. I believe it was Frozen because it's a Disney movie, so and she didn't realize that. So she's sitting there a week after her parent died, watching this movie with her kids about a parent that died, and it was very upsetting to her. And she left. She did. She gathered up her kids, who threw a fit, but she left. She couldn't sit there. News article, again, the 24/7 news cycle and social media just feed into all of people's trauma, because you can always find something that's traumatic. And then the problem is with the algorithms that we're all part of now with this. If you read one story about something, then you get suggested that story or similar stories for the rest of your life. And that really feeds into the traumatic events. Also, the language we use around the pandemic has become very triggering to people. When people hear new normal, there's actually a physical reaction that people will hear. It's people saying hearing the new normal. Or when they hear things like, I was supposed to go do this in 2020, we all know where that's going to end. So all of that kind of language is very traumatic, and makes you think and feel a certain kind of way. So what can trigger trauma? Again, trauma can be triggered by a lot of things. It's experienced differently among people, and they can be highly specific or general. And the 9 common ones are being ignored. People who have been traumatized, especially if they've been traumatized by violence, do not like being ignored. Being blamed for something. Trauma survivors live with a lot of shame, and they feel it very intensely. So even perceiving being blamed for something is very hard for them. Feeling helpless, that triggers a lot of that feelings. Someone leaving. A lot of people with unresolved trauma develop codependent issues with not just a romantic relationship with anybody. So being left. Yes, absolutely. Media coverage of something over and over again makes it hard for people to heal and move on. It's all the time. It's constant. Being judged, having too much to do. What other triggers have you observed in other people over your course of experience that maybe were surprising to you, or that you didn't think of being a trigger until someone told you it was a trigger? Someone already put in the chat the media showing things over and over and over again. If you have any other examples, if there's in your experience, I don't mean your personal experience with whatever trauma you might have, but as you're over your lifespan, if you encountered somebody who said that's triggering for me, or you realized it was triggering for them, do you have any examples that you would like to share? Loud noise is a very big trigger for a lot of people. They have a heightened startle response. So loud noises, even if it doesn't sound loud to you, sounds extremely loud to them. I have a friend of mine who is adopting 3 foster children, and they are adorable. But one of them had, these are foster kids that are not babies, so they have a lot of they've had a lot of trauma. And one of them, when fire, yes. Smelling smoke, being by like a regular, like a fireplace or a bonfire, can be very triggering for people who've experienced any kind of related issue with that. It's especially even the fake fires that like people, you have like the video of the fire. It can be hard. That was an example given in the chat. Fireworks, yes, fireworks. So there are actually some communities who are seeking to ban fireworks altogether, because they are bad for animals. They're bad for so many people who have, it's a loud noise, it's lights, it's people yelling, it's the smell. I mean, it's a lot of things. And so they're wondering what the benefit of fireworks are, right? So that's one of the things that is, especially for a lot of people who are combat veterans, that's very hard. Cold and hot, yes. Being too cold, being too hot reminds them of that, or touching things that are cold and hot. They feel it more intensely. But the loud noise example, my friend's foster child would cover her ears when they were watching TV. I mean, not even like out and being loud, cover her ears. And and he was like, I don't know why she doesn't like to, because it's loud to her. It's very loud to her. And so they were able to get her the kind of earmuff things, and she's much more comfortable now working with that. And she has a therapist that's helping her work through this trigger. But in the meantime, making her comfortable has been priority. In the chat, we have somebody who shared that jumping off a high rock in the cold water caused a reaction that you didn't expect. Right, and that's the thing is sometimes you are, and I'm not going to say that you were triggered or not triggered, but any reaction that you are unexpecting, there's that moment of why did I feel that way? Why was that so weird? Why was that so scary? Why was that upsetting? Why did that make me feel a certain kind of way? And that there are things that happen in your life that have that happen. I was on we were in Honduras, I think, and we were going to like a wildlife preserve. And I don't have fear of heights, I don't have fear of bridges, it's all fine. We were walking across the suspension bridge, and I stopped in the middle, and my husband said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I don't know what's wrong. I feel like I can't walk any further. Like I am panicking. I'm upset. I don't have panic attacks or anxiety attacks." And he's like, "Are you sick?" And I said, I don't know. I just feel very unsafe right now on this bridge." And so I was able to, there's people behind me, it's a narrow bridge, we can't turn back around. So I get back across the bridge and I had to sit down. I still don't know what in that situation made me feel unsafe. But it was a very jarring reaction, especially because I didn't know the genesis of it. Some other things that we have coming in the chat are sirens. Yes, sirens. I think sirens cause everybody a little bit of a reaction, but depending on what your trauma is related to sirens, especially children who grew up in homes where there's a lot of chaos and sirens around, they have a reaction to that. This is also interesting. Like if you are from a small town, but you go for the weekend or vacation or whatever to a larger city where there are sirens all the time, people from I grew up in the second smallest county in Indiana, so I'm from a very small town. You notice the sirens more. People who live there, it's just part of their background noise, but you notice the sirens more. Because when you've heard a siren, something's wrong. You're looking around, do I need to get out of the way? What's going on? Pressure on the body, so like a hug. Some people like that, some people don't like that. The weighted blankets, those are a very popular thing, but some people could not sustain it. There's no way. Being touched at all. Some people do not like being touched. Some people need to be touched. All those things can be triggering. That's why, I never, even with little kids, like I don't hug them without being invited to hug them by them. Parents are like, give so-and-so a hug before they leave. I'm like, no, I'm out. If you don't want to hug, no big deal. We have somebody else who shared that they worked at a summer camp where some families were triggered by rain because of flooding. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if you ever live through any kind of natural disaster, anything that precipitates that is going to be very upsetting to you. I have a friend who lived in New Orleans during Katrina. She was young. She was a child during Katrina. But now she lives, I think she lives in Atlanta. She lives somewhere in Georgia now. If it rains, she will drive north, no matter what is going on. If there's a large amount of rain coming, because she remembers that. She remembers hearing all the warnings saying evacuate, evacuate, evacuate. Everyone around her saying, they always say that they're overreacting. And then they actually got to Houston during Katrina. But that lives in her brain, and she actually will have to stop herself. Like, I am on the interstate driving north because there's a storm coming, and I have to stop this. She's gotten some therapy and things like that. But triggers can be all kinds of stuff. Yes, any kind of mess. That's also in the chat. Disorganization can be very, very triggering for some people, especially if they grew up in a house. If they grew up with somebody who had a hoarding issue, or if they feel out of control. It's part of the control thing, right? I need to be able to control my environment and what's in my environment. Somebody else shared, they had 3 trees fall on their house when her child was 3 years old, and she wouldn't speak for hours after it happens, and now storms trigger her. Thank you for sharing that. That's something that you wouldn't think about, right? Assuming the child was safe. Yeah, it was scary, but now we've moved on. But that's not how our minds work. That's not how our brains work. That 3-year-old child interpreted that as being danger. It was danger, and that lives in her now, right? And so those are things that are very upsetting to people. And it can be large triggers, small triggers. Some things that haven't triggered you ever all of a sudden start triggering you. It changes. It's kind of a moving target, and it's very it can be very destabilizing. It can be very confusing to service providers. Because this person's come in your office the last 3 times and they've been fine, and you talked about this, And now this time you have the exact same candle burning and you're like, I can't smell that smell. And you have no idea why. They may not know why. So it's a matter of having those conversations. And thank you guys so much for sharing your experience with triggers. I know it's something that's hard to think about, but I really do appreciate you sharing it. It helps people understand just how complex triggers can be for people. So trauma triggers in the brain. So again, we're back to the brain. This is something that's happening outside of your consciousness. So what happens first is a trauma trigger occurs. Your brain says, send out the stress response for survival. Your amygdala gets going, that cortisol, that adrenaline gets going. Survival is achieved, right? You didn't die because of this trigger. So that reaction, your brain's like, super, great job. It's encoded as successful. So then it's embedded in your neural networks in the limbic system as this is how we react when this happens because it works. It kept us alive. Your bottom part of your brain is not concerned with your emotional health and well-being, stability, any of that. It is primarily focused on survival. How are we going to survive this? So once this reaction is what again is objectively an overreaction to something that seems to me or you not to be triggering at all, is embedded as a positive thing because it works. We survived it. Keep it moving. So then that leads into a constant state, an overreactive state of alertness. Right? You are constantly alert, and then the trigger happens again. So it just goes around and around and around. This is called a trauma loop, a limbic trauma loop, if you're going to be technical about it, because it involves your limbic system, which places cortisol, oxytocin, adrenaline, all of those things. It also helps build those neural networks. And again, as we talked about earlier, the more this pathway happens and the more you are in this loop, the stronger and faster it gets. So this loop could happen over the course of days, weeks, or months. It could happen over the course of 5 minutes. It just depends. A lot of trauma therapy, especially CBT and that kind of thing, cognitive behavioral therapy, is about breaking these loops, is about disrupting this loop. And maybe it's between those first 2 steps. Trauma trigger occurs. Well, if you know your trigger and you can tell your brain this is not real, I simplified, and again, not a mental health provider, this is a very simple explanation of what would happen. This is not real. We are not in danger. We're going to survive it. All of that can be circumvented. Or maybe it's between the stress signal and survival is achieved, where you are able to develop coping mechanisms to say, okay, that's done now, whether it was a panic attack or, I was pacing or an angry outburst or destroying property or crying or whatever it was. And I have survived, but that was not pleasant for me. That was not good for my body. So then you can kind of disrupt that loop, because once you get into a trauma loop, it is very difficult to get out. Some of you, I think, work with survivors of immediate trauma, like things that have happened very recently, or people who are still living in trauma. Sometimes you'll meet people who are so far in this loop, it's very difficult to even work with them to get any kind of, build a rapport, or get paperwork done, or have them, apply for assistance or whatever. It's hard because they are in this loop constantly. And depending on where they are, they're not able to carry on a conversation or understand what you're saying or retain things. Trauma and the trauma loop impacts your memory. Sometimes when people testify in court after a traumatic event, they can't remember everything that happened, or it's in different orders. An interesting thing is when there's an officer-involved shooting, most, not all, police departments have a policy of waiting 48 to 72 hours before taking a statement from the officer who was involved, because you are more likely to get a coherent story, right? Than it just happened and there's all this chaos happening. You don't remember what order it happened in. The problem is that when someone testifies, at the scene, when they take a statement from the victim, here's what happened, here's all the things that happened, and they remember things later. In a trial setting, it can be perceived as dishonest. Well, you didn't tell the officer that at the scene. No, I didn't remember. I physically couldn't remember it at the scene. They don't know that. They just have these memories that come back to them, right? It's not a reliable necessarily narrative until it comes back all the way, or you get into counseling a year later or whatever. So it's important to remember that comprehension and memory are also impacted by trauma. And also, this loop, the stronger it gets, the faster it gets, contributes to misinformation. Misinformation inside of you is saying you're not safe. Am I safe? You start to question your own. You gaslight yourself. you gaslight yourself into believing things that maybe aren't true, and it's very destabilizing. It's very confusing. They almost always activate your amygdala to react as a there and then experience. Like, this is what happened then, this is what happened, and we're going to respond the same way because we lived through it, as opposed to this is what's happening here and now. It's a different set of circumstances, because your amygdala takes over and you can't get to that different set of circumstances in the current reality. Again, all of this loop contributes to anxiety, depression, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disorders. Autoimmune disorders have been closely linked to trauma and trauma loops, because your body's already overreactive. So that can feed into your immune system. Again, not a medical professional. Do not take this as diagnostic advice, but there's research around that of when your body is constantly in a state of alertness, it leads to inflammation. It can lead to autoimmune disorders. Also increased risk for cancers as well. So trauma triggers also lead to dysregulation. Dysregulation, and this is spelled correctly, some people will spell it with a D-I-S, but it is D-Y-S, is a poor ability to manage your responses and keep them within an acceptable range of emotions. This is becoming much more of a common term. You're going to hear people say this more frequently. They were dysregulating, I was dysregulated, the kids were dysregulated, or whatever. The opposite, obviously, is regulated, where you feel like you are in pretty good control of your emotions, have an ability to keep them. But however, dysregulation leads to the 3 Ds: distracted minds, distracted emotions, and disruptive behaviors. So that's the kind of escalation that you might see as a service provider, or if you live with somebody who is traumatized, or you love somebody who's traumatized. They're distracted. Then they get worked up, angry, distressed, or whatever, and then they have a behavior. Behavior can also, that's not a great word for it, but that's kind of how the research is. I prefer like a reaction or a response, because a behavior you necessarily think of like doing something, but a reaction or response could be the absence of doing something when you should be doing something. So I think I try to think of it a little bit differently. But that's what happens. Dysregulation. Dysregulation is a huge part of trauma and trauma response. And the way to counteract dysregulation is to have access to a person who is regulated. So that's why traumatic people a lot of times will start to develop codependence with people who are generally regulated individuals. So another real talk moment. This is something that I am on a soapbox about, because this is the rise of the use of this word. I ask people, please stop using the word trigger when you really mean offended. Right? People, on social media will be like, oh, I Taco Bell discontinued the Mexican pizza, now I'm triggered. That was literally a meme that went around when Taco Bell apparently discontinued the Mexican pizza. I don't eat there, so I don't know. I saw it over and over and over again. As we talked earlier, when you talk about trauma and things being traumatized and everyone has trauma, does the word start to lose meaning? For triggers, it's the same thing. Using trigger incorrectly, using it casually, starts to lose the meaning. And triggers are very significant events for people who have them, right? It's not the same as being angry or offended. It minimizes trauma when you do that. There's a little cartoon here. It talks about not a trigger of being anxious or upset or uncomfortable, having strong reactions, and learning to regulate them as part of life. You're not always going to be happy and sunshine all the time. That's part of it. Triggers are like a trap door for people, right? They could be doing fine for weeks, months, or years, be triggered and feel like they're back to the moment that trauma happened. It is a completely disorienting experience. You lose a sense of spatial ability, of time. It's very upsetting. So Patricia shared in the chat that she is always amazed that teachers are not aware of trauma responses and the effect it has on children. Absolutely. So I get, my mom was a teacher for 40-some years, so I really do appreciate what teachers do and all the things that they have to try to accomplish in a classroom. But yeah, a lot of teachers have not ever received trauma training. And here's the thing: I started in this work in 2003. When I started trauma-informed care, trauma was not even in the vernacular, right? Like, we had a list of things we had to accomplish with a client, checklist that you did it, and if they didn't want to do it, you could take it out of the program. That's how things worked. that was an awareness that did not exist. And then probably 2006, 2007 is when people really started leaning heavily into understanding trauma in my field, nonprofit field, and learning about it. But teachers still, I mean, it's a lot of, and I have a room of 30 kids. They can't sit down and talk to every kid, but even understanding understanding what's happening, understanding how they feel, understanding what's going on at their home. But yeah, punishing the child instead of giving them a space to process or time to process is hard, right? Because then again, these children learn how I feel is wrong, how I feel is bad, how I feel is whatever, and that's what they encode. And then, as Judy shared, yeah, the trauma and secondary trauma teachers have experienced, being a teacher right now is not a great place to be. They're also trying to be everything to everybody, right? Because everyone's like, we should incorporate this in school and this in school and that in school. It's overwhelming for both the students and the teachers. And I think that, but the lack of awareness is hard for teachers because they don't understand how they're feeling. They don't understand how these students might be feeling. Everyone just knows that it's kind of chaotic and bad. That's how people feel. This languishing is the word that they use for this. And that causes disconnection, that causes distance. And so teachers aren't invested necessarily in the students. The students aren't interested in learning, and that can continue for years and years and years. But it's trauma and education is so important, and something that we just don't talk about very often. The trainings are out there, but again, a teacher who's been working a 12-hour day, leading Zoom classes all day during the height of the pandemic, doesn't want to sit through a 3-hour webinar about trauma, or doesn't want to. It's just so exhausting and overwhelming to think about how they would have to change their classroom and approach to do that, and still teach the tests that they need to get standardized scores on. It's a really tricky thing, but absolutely, schools are an excellent place to talk about trauma and be part of trauma. Some school systems are fortunate enough to have a social worker or psychologist on staff that can help with that, with both teachers and with students. But a lot of school systems can't afford that. They don't have that, especially in school systems where they are, in impoverished parts of the city, where they are racial or ethnic diverse organizations. Schools usually don't have those resources. So it's a good point, but it is a significant place that we could probably address trauma much earlier than we do. But how do we do that? That's the question. So what is a trauma response? So again, we have this fancy definition, but basically a trauma response is how your brain and body react to a trauma trigger, right? That's what it is. If you want to use the fancy definition, you can, you're welcome to. But it's basically how your brain and body respond. Again, it is very important to remember that most trauma responses are involuntary, unconscious, or otherwise unknown to the traumatized individual. They don't know why they feel the way they feel. They don't know why they act the way they act, especially if they've blocked the trauma, if the trauma is unresolved, or if they have little to no awareness of trauma. The other thing with traumatized people is, for instance, if you are, when I worked with domestic violence survivors, they have a lot of stuff going on. They're trying to find housing. They're trying to make sure they have a job. They're trying to keep custody of their kids. Maybe they have immigration issues. Maybe they are involved in a criminal justice case now. So when I come in and I'm all like, okay, that's all great, but let's talk about your trauma responses and your trauma triggers and your trauma this and your trauma that. To them, they're like, no, I need to be able to feed my kids and keep them safe. I don't have time to deal with my other stuff right now. So I think that it's important to remember that, right? That sometimes people that you're going to work with aren't in a space to be able to acknowledge or process their trauma because they're literally trying to survive. And right now, with prices and housing and inflation, all the way they are, that might take all of their energy. They may not have any energy to dedicate to psychological well-being, and that's fine. That's really fine. But and ideally everybody would have those things settled and then be able to work on these trauma responses. But that's not what our world is right now. So it's important to be sensitive to that. It's important to be sensitive to everyone has to prioritize what they need right now and how they need it. And it's important to understand that what you think is a priority in their life may not be their priority. But it's, again, a lot of them are involuntary unconscious, and it's painful. It's painful to pick through all of those things and figure out what the trauma was, what your triggers are, how you're feeling. It's painful and it can be time consuming, and some people just do not have the energy to devote to that right now. All right, so there are 4 basic trauma responses. Again, research people don't always agree. Sometimes people will say there are a little bit more. Sometimes flag, flop, and friend are put in here. But these are the main 4 that are widely accepted. So here's the thing. Nearly all humans start with freeze. That is what we are programmed to do. Freeze, and your amygdala is going to decide the best way for you to survive this, even if it's for a millisecond. This is the kind of the deer in the headlights moment of where you're trying to figure out what you're going to do. It's your brain's way of activating the amygdala and entering the limbic trauma cycle. How are we going to survive this? Is successful making decisions moment to moment to moment. So think about when you wake up in the middle of the night, and the first thing you do is you stop and you're listening. You're listening to see what woke you up. Did you hear something? Is there something in your house? Is there something to miss? And it can be just for a second, but you stop and you're listening and you're still to try to figure out what's next. Your brain, that's your brain trying to figure out if something's in your house, what do we do? If your kid is upset and crying, what do we do? If your dog needs to go out, if the wind is bashing your screen door against your house, like all those kind of things. So that's that moment of freezing. Trauma responses can be limited to one of these or cycle through these responses rapidly. One that's pretty new to the trauma responses, usually it's fight, flight, or freeze, is fawn. Have any of you guys heard about this response before or have talked about this in other trainings? The fawn response? You can put it in the chat if you want to, if you want coffee. Fawn is something that's very interesting because up to this point, these behaviors don't look that unusual, right? But if they become a response, Jessica said she's never seen it, but it makes, once I saw it and started seeing it about 18 months, 2 years ago, it makes so much sense, right? If you're going to survive a situation, this fawning response, especially in the Midwest, because of our culture, might be the most effective response. People who are codependent, people who are pleasing, they have a lack of boundaries, right? They have, and those are very common things. Don't leave me, don't abandon me, I'll be better. They avoid conflict. They are very conflict avoidant. They want to fit in. It is absolutely a trauma response. It's absolutely a trauma response because you are trying to. Appalachia. That's also Indiana, in case you're wondering. I actually do a whole training on Midwestern culture and how it impacts our ability, our boundaries and consent and ideas of consent. And it's one of the most popular trainings that I do because, we don't all think about how we are part of all of this and how that impacts our ability to have boundaries with other people and understand consent because we grew up in it. Midwesterners, including Kentucky, have some of the highest instances of people staying in the same place over generation. So we all absorb that. But yeah, it's absolutely. So thinking about how fawn might look. The other 3 are pretty easy to see. They're pretty easy to identify, but fawn's different. Fawn is something that you are building yourself up to this outward persona that you feel will make people love you and stay with you and not leave you. I'm not going to fight. I'm not going to fuss. People in abusive relationships, a lot of times fawn is their most safe response for them. It doesn't work. Trying to keep somebody who is violent happy all the time is not a thing that can happen. That's on the person. But victims sometimes will resort to the fawn. Oh yeah, somebody said is this still Jessica? Yeah. They had an experience with fawning and had no idea after the fact that something had happened wrong. because these are, it doesn't seem like it would be wrong, right? It is, but then you're like, what is going on here? So the fawn response again is kind of new to this main four, and it's just so interesting, and it explains a lot about how people respond. Again, I think especially in kind of this Midwestern, Middle America area. Again, these are basic responses to trauma. They can also inform a lot of reactions and behaviors. So, for instance, flight might mean, flight might mean I'm going to go home from work early today because I'm feeling overwhelmed. That's flight. But you may not say, oh, Jenny's having a flight reaction. You're going to say, Jenny's going home from work early today, right? That's the reaction and the response. Flight is what caused that, the flight feeling. There are also drastic survival reflexes. These are more common during the actual traumatic event, but depending on the level of trauma and complexity of the trauma, they can also occur after the traumatic event. One of the reasons I include this is because these are, again, very drastic reactions. So if this happens to somebody, they may require medical attention. So it's important that you guys kind of know what they are and can recognize them, even if they're not so common in post-trauma world. I also do a training on the neurobiology of trauma to help people understand how someone would react during a traumatic situation where these would happen more frequently, but they also can happen post-trauma as well. So acute dissociation. So this is a sudden disconnection from reality or pseudo-catatonic state. Somebody who shared that their daughter didn't speak for hours after these trees fell on their houses. That's not acute dissociation, but it's dissociation. I'm just going to stop, right? This is different than dissociative identity disorder, which is a psychological mental health issue. Acute disconnection means that they are just done. Like you're talking, and then all of a sudden they stop talking, they're silent, they may close their eyes. They're aware they're in control of their body or whatever, but they will fix on something and just stare off. They're not talking, they won't respond. Usually like their dilation is poor, their respiratory slows down. That could be somebody who needs medical attention. Tonic immobility. So tonic immobility affects around 50% of trauma survivors of acute traumatic events. So this is what's known as conscious paralysis. So you are awake, you are alert, you know what's happening, you can encode what's happening, but you cannot move or speak. This is very typical with any kind of like a hostage situation. If you were a hostage, a bank robbery and there's somebody with a gun, any kind of physical assault or sexual assault, where you know what's happening, but your body can't feel it, you can't fight it off, and that's because your brain has decided that not moving or playing dead, for lack of a better term, is what's going to make your body survive this. Your brain's decided that for you and has made that decision. And that is also where a lot of guilt and shame lies for trauma survivors. They feel like they didn't do anything. What they don't understand is they couldn't. They could not. They physically could not have fought back or changed anything. I do remember after September 11th, and even with some of the more recent, the Uvalde and the Parkland shootings, everyone has opinions on what they would have done had they had been there or on those planes or outside that school, what they would have done. We do not know what we would have done until we are in those situations. The reasons that you do fire drills, tornado drills, active shooter drills is in the hope that your brain will encode that as the appropriate response. So if a fire actually does happen, your muscle and brain memory will be, okay, I go here, here, and here and meet out there, right? So it's not useful. You can have an opinion, obviously, but it's not useful to say, I absolutely would or would not do this in that situation, because you don't know. And you are not going to have the ability to critically think through, because again, in an acute situation like that, like a shooting, like a hijacking, like a hostage situation, like a sexual assault, it's survival. It's bottom brain usage, right? Bottom brain. I'm going to survive this. And whatever gets me through, it's what I'm going to do. The third one is collapsed immobility. So collapsed immobility is total loss of consciousness, muscle tone, some cases bodily functions. People might urinate on themselves, defecate on themselves. This is kind of a fainting response, right? So it's unusual, though, in trauma responses because it's a result of hypoarousal. Almost everything else we've talked about is hyper, right? Everything is above and beyond, doing the most, being extra, all those things. This is hypo. It's low, right? Your parasympathetic part of your limbic system floods your system and says, we need to rest and digest. That's the term, rest and digest. But it lowers your heart rate, it lowers your blood pressure, it lowers your body temperature, and it lowers it immediately. Your body has decided the only way we may not survive this, so let's just be unconscious, or it's probably better if you're not awake for this of whatever's happening. So that can be very hard to watch or hard to see, but that happens to people, and it's important to understand what's happening to them, and they do need medical attention because of the heart rate, blood pressure, that kind of thing. Collapse of mobility is very common with people who have survived kidnappings when if they go back to where they were kidnapped, or if they go back to the place where they were held hostage or whatever. A lot of times collapse of mobility happens. But generally speaking, these three things are not common post-trauma, but if they do happen, it can be a medical emergency. I won't read through all of this. I put them all in. Again, if we were in person, this slide would not be so busy, but I want to make sure you guys all have these. So trauma reactions, there are overall reactions of just kind of these feelings and these, having dreams and memories, having problems at work. You start avoiding people. Maybe you feel like you can't regulate yourself, so you're starting to stay home from places. Then there are also physical reactions, upset stomachs, severe headaches, all those kind of things. One of the last two I do want to draw your attention to, self-harm and disordered eating. People who do not have a history of self-harm or disordered eating, especially as adults who just start. By self-harm, I mean cutting, burning themselves, those kind of things. Disordered eating, overeating, undereating, bulimia, anorexia. That's usually a large sign of a trauma. And then major changes in physical appearance. Shaving your head, that's always the one people think of because of Britney Spears when she actually had a traumatic reaction that was on national news. Piercings, hair color, tattoos, anything like that. I actually had a friend who recently, his daughter is 22, had a incomplete suicide attempt, was able to get into an inpatient facility and found out, disclosed that she had been sexually assaulted at the age of 12, so 10 years ago. Now, 10 years ago, this girl, which no one knew about it. No one knew. She never told anybody. 10 years ago, this girl lost a bunch of weight. She changed her hair. I significantly changed her hair. Started changing her clothes differently. But nobody really recognized it because she was kind of a teenager. Like, oh, it's teens or whatever. But these were significant changes that somebody probably should have been like, what is going on here? What is happening? But no one asked her. She now has dissociative identity disorder as a result of that, and she's doing much better now. But those kind of large outward changes can be an indication of trauma. It can also be somebody who is exploring a new identity, who has some kind of life change, divorce, kids are out of the house or whatever. But absent those things, that might be some sort of reaction to trauma. Emotional reactions. These are things that could happen to people: unable to trust, being withdrawn, feeling detached is a big one right now. Again, as people have mentioned, just feeling kind of blah, feeling like nothing good's ever going to happen again. I'm just kind of going through the motions, kind of making it through the day. Those can all be trauma reactions. And again, not all of these are going to be over and above, outwardly visible to you, but a lot of them, if you pay attention to yourself and to others, you're going to start seeing these kind of things, especially when you're talking to people. If we were in person, I could see watching in the audience, people get some of these reactions talking about trauma. I can see it happening. That's kind of when I know how to take a break and all this kind of things. But you can see it in other people if you start looking for these kind of things to happen. So here's your trauma iceberg. This is it's a very popular concept. It's not always this drawing, but how an iceberg is only this big on top and then this big on the bottom. Here's all the things on top that you're seeing, and below that are all the things that are feeding into those behaviors. So think those reactions and responses in red at the top, anger, lying, non-compliance, superficiality, those are all outward things that are happening. The things at the bottom are what's causing that. Helplessness, irritability, feeling incompetent, rejection, losing trust. And so again, those are reactions and behaviors. Those are responses. Those are not choices necessarily they're making. Once the trauma loop starts and it's very difficult to stop and reset it, especially without external intervention, without someone helping you say, this is what's happening, here's what we need to talk about, and going through that. They don't understand their own reactions, and a lot of times they're embarrassed. Sometimes you get clients who come back and say, hey, I'm really sorry about what happened last time I was here. Sorry I yelled at you, or started crying, or while it's happening, they'll say, I have no idea why this is happening. They'll say that. And reassuring them that again, it's not a violent situation, that they don't have to, that you don't need to know why they're acting that way. They can feel how they feel. It's also very destabilizing to be unsure of your emotional regulation, to not know when you go to the movies with your kids, to not know when you go out for the night with your friends, to not know if you go to a wedding, to not know, going to the grocery store, if something's going to trigger you and then beyond your control, you are crying or angry or upset or irritable, or also back to that fawn response. It's very destabilizing to have to keep up an outward appearance or facade that is not genuine to who you are. It's exhausting and it's destabilizing. It can really distort your sense of self. So I challenge you guys, when you're dealing with someone you perceive as difficult, to reframe your internal dialogue, right? When you think, what is wrong with this person? And trust me, everyone thinks that, what is wrong with this person? Try to reframe it in your head, even just for a second, of what happened to this person. What has happened to this person that has made them this dysregulated? Because most people, the majority of people, 99% of people, aren't that dysregulated just because they are, wilding out for fun and I don't know, entertainment, attention, I don't know. And when you think that way, so now everybody has trauma, and you take that extra second to think of what happened to this person, even if you still need to de-escalate the situation and all those things, it can change how you feel about them in that moment. It can change how you treat them in that moment. Especially as we talked about, somebody had mentioned that the trauma of teachers. I try to think about this when I'm out someplace, where there's a server, like at a restaurant, or a cashier at a store. They have been through a lot with the pandemic, and people just treat them like garbage. Flight attendants are the same way. People treat them any kind of way now, it seems like. And so if they're waiting on me and they're irritable, or they are, what some people might call rude, I try this. Instead of trying to be rude back or trying to be, rising to their level of irritation, I try to think, what has this person been through? How has this person been treated by other people, other patrons like me all day long? And that really helps me kind of keep myself in perspective of, I'm not going, because your reaction is to match their attitude. So it's a matter of really trying to think in that mindset. So a little bit on trauma response. I include this because I think A, it's interesting, and B, it's a reasonably new or recognized response, kind of like fawn, and that's hyper-independence. Have any of you guys ever heard of hyper-independence? It's also sometimes called ultra-independence or extreme independence. This is only recently recognized as a trauma strategy, and it develops when someone learns or perceives that they cannot trust others to support them or their needs. If they feel like, especially in childhood, if their needs weren't met or supported, or if they are able to leave an abusive relationship or a violent relationship, sometimes hyper-independence is what you get. Signs of hyper-independence, they're pathologically overachievers, right? They're doing the most 100% of the time. They are workaholic. Their biggest fear in life is asking for help, because they aren't weak, they aren't needy, they don't ask for help. They don't delegate tasks. They do everything themselves. They do everything for themselves as well. I had a friend who had this issue, and she was undergoing treatment for cancer, and wouldn't let any of us help her drive to her chemo appointments. Just do it herself, until it got to the point where the doctor was like, you can't drive yourself back and forth anymore. It's not safe. And then it was very hard for her to ask the house for help. being known as the dependable one in your friends, family, social work groups, right? So-and-so is the dependable one. Insisting they're fine when it's obvious they're not. These are people who you'll see start to cry and stop themselves from crying in public. Or somebody who's clearly angry and they'll tell you that tight lip, fine, it's fine. This is often overlooked or misinterpreted response because these are traits that are admired in American society, right? Like, even from childhood, oh yeah, they're an overachiever. Oh, they're so independent. Oh, they can do everything themselves. Reliability, dependable, that kind of stoic idea. We admire this in American society as attributes. Also, you could be all of these things and not have been traumatized, right? You could be all these things because your personality is a very type A personality, as a reaction to an anxiety disorder or something like that. But with trauma, they don't recognize this as a reaction to past trauma. It's part of their identity, and it's a very important part of their identity, right? Being the dependable one, being the self-sufficient one is part of who they are, and they need to hold on to that. The reason I also include this is because this describes a lot of people who work in nonprofit work. A lot of people go into this line of work because they have experienced trauma and they want to help others, which is fantastic. But if you haven't identified and addressed your own trauma, it comes out in ways like this. So everyone thinks that you're great at your job, and you probably are on the surface, but you are struggling with other trauma responses. So especially when you are with your colleagues or when you're doing your self-inventories, look for this. Look for hyper-independent qualities. If you have children in your life, maybe don't push these things as hard as we do. Yeah, you want them to be self-sufficient and independent people, but it's also okay to ask for help. Let them see you ask for help. Let them see you not have all the balls in the air all the time. Let them see you let things go. It's important. It's in a way it normalizes that for them. Also, a coworker, if someone's, again, we are in the Midwest, so somebody will apologize profusely for forgetting to make copies for a meeting. Verbally say, everyone forgets stuff. It's not a big deal. Or we can all, I can run down the hall and make those copies right now. But letting people know that this hyper independence, ultra independence, whatever you want to call it, is a reaction to something that doesn't define them, right? They cannot be the dependable one on Thursdays, and it's fine. But it's something to think of, especially with your colleagues. So post-traumatic growth. This is a pretty heavy topic, and so I always try to put in there that the thing is, experiencing trauma doesn't always mean you're going to be kind of this mess of reactions and responses and triggers the rest of your life. And that's kind of how people, I think, perceive trauma. It's one of the reasons people are resistant to labeling their trauma or saying I'm a trauma survivor, or even seeking help for it. It's just easier to kind of stuff it down and hope it doesn't come out, which it always comes out somehow. But for those who are able to process and resolve trauma, there are documented areas of positive growth, right? I mean, new sense of possibilities. You value your relationships. You appreciate your life. You feel like you are resilient and strong, or you have a deepened sense of spirituality or religion. Again, it doesn't mean that the person deserves the trauma, or you should tell them they should be grateful for it. It just shows how resilient people can be, right? When they're given the opportunity and tools to heal from trauma. The interesting thing is they found over the last probably 15 to 20 years of research is these 5 domains of growth after trauma are also the same 5 domains that people express regret about on their deathbed or with a terminal illness. Somebody who is actively dying will say, hey, I wish I had just appreciated little things more, or I wish I had tried to make new friends, or any of that. So showing that something very bad like trauma, especially acute and complex trauma, can give you that insight while you still have time to change things is kind of, at least something positive could come out of this. Again, it doesn't mean anybody deserves it. It's not saying you should be grateful for it. It just means that people are resilient. And the other good news here is that research indicates that about 66% of trauma survivors who are able to resolve their trauma report significant post-traumatic growth. right? That's substantially higher than the 25% who are unable or unwilling or don't have resources to resolve their trauma that progress to post-traumatic stress disorder. That's 25%. So 66% are saying however they resolved it. Again, it could be with therapy, it could be on their own, who knows, have this sense of growth. And 25% are continue into a more significant and severe part of trauma. So it's not all bad. It's not all doom and gloom. There are ways that trauma can be overcome. There are ways that people can grow from trauma. And I just like to put that in there. So Tammy says that there's a TED Talk about a game. Sorry, I have to scroll up and down because that's what the chat does to me. There's she had a concussive disorder. There's a game to cope and heal about why she did it. It's a basic introduction about post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic growth. And it's over in the chat. There's a link to it and along with her app. And that's great. I mean, it's great. And that's the thing about people with trauma, especially when you're working with other people and they have trauma, is sharing these kind of things of like, this doesn't have to be your life forever, right? There are things that can come out of this that are better. Again, you never deserved any of this. I wish it didn't happen to you, but this isn't going to be the rest of your life. That's very powerful for people to hear. And these things like this game and this TED Talk we don't talk enough about that, about how you can grow and change into something different and something more evolved, right, after these really difficult experiences. Thank you for sharing that link. I'm gonna have to go check that out. So now we are in trauma-informed approaches. Yay! So what is trauma-informed care? Again, there's your fancy definition. You have it in your slides. If you want to read it, use it, keep it, have it tattooed on your body. But more simply put, trauma-informed care, TIC, assumes that someone has a trauma, that someone most likely has a history of trauma, acknowledges that role, and creates a culture that respects that experience and responds appropriately. Again, trauma-informed care can apply to anyone: your neighbor, your family, your friends, your bowling team, your coworkers, your colleagues, your clients, your board, your volunteers, not just for people who obviously have some trauma because they've come to you for help. If you are an organization that serves traumatized people, obviously they have trauma, but most other people around you have trauma too. Again, 9 out of 10 adults have experienced notable trauma in the US. It's probably actually 10 out of 10, but 9 out of 10 will report it. It's a safe bet to assume most people you interact with have experienced trauma. So trauma-informed care is the equivalent of universal precautions for bodily fluids. It's the emotional equivalent of it. You all know that in a hospital setting or any kind of setting, if there is someone cuts themselves and they're bleeding, if there's any kind of like that, there are universal precautions: gloves, bleach, all these kind of things. TIC is the emotional equivalent of that. We assume everybody has trauma. We're just waiting to see how that trauma plays out, and then we're going to respond to that trauma appropriately. That's what it is. The catch is, the thing that makes this a little trickier to put into practice, is that most people with unresolved trauma have little to no knowledge about trauma or its effects, so they don't always know the role it plays in their behavior. Again, they may be crying and say, I don't know why I'm crying. They may come in 2 weeks after an outburst and say, I'm really sorry, I don't know what was going on that day. But they don't connect it back to a trauma that may have happened years ago. It may have happened last week. Who knows? They don't know their triggers. They don't know their responses. They don't know their reactions. So you saying, hey, I think you're crying because you're traumatized, is not something they can really absorb and hear in that moment. So trauma-informed care tries to address the responses and reactions in ways that are impactful, but also aren't, you need to fix yourself, right? That are more supportive and nurturing and hoping to get them to a place where they're able to heal at some point. So the 4 R's of trauma-informed care realize that all people at all levels have a basic realization of trauma. People who do not recognize trauma themselves often are very good at recognizing it in other people and will say that person's traumatized, they need to do whatever, they need to make whatever changes, but they can't apply that to themselves. Recognize people within organizations are able to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. So you have everybody who's kind of into trauma and they understand it. Number 2 is people in your organization recognize the signs of trauma. Not just that everyone has trauma, but how those reactions might play out. Number 3, you respond by practicing a trauma-informed approach. So trauma is no longer something that's, over here in the corner or something that you're dealing with. It's just something that's incorporated into your culture and treatment plans and approaches to working with people. And you have to resist re-traumatization. This one's a little trickier, right? Because some practices may compound trauma, and you try to avoid re-traumatization. One of the things that happens that you will see re-traumatization happen is when all the information that you have to gather for grants, especially government grants. There's so much demographic information. There's so much stuff you have to ask that can feel very invasive to people, especially traumatized people. So it's important that you explain why you're collecting the information that you're collecting. It's important that you say, if I have to ask, what is your race? Here's why I need to know that. Here's why you are perfectly fine to say you don't want to answer that question. Also, gatekeeping. People who are traumatized are very sensitive to gatekeeping. They are very, that means that they see you as a person who has the resources, that gets to decide how to dole out the resources. It doesn't matter if it's true or not, that's how they see you. People who are from impoverished backgrounds, impoverished or socioeconomic backgrounds, are very sensitive to classism and elitism, or what they perceive as classism and elitism. So if you are using words they don't understand, or they feel like you're talking down to them, that can be re-traumatizing. So constantly evaluating your procedures, constantly evaluating yourself to make sure you are performing this work to the best of your ability. So the road to trauma-informed care. So I hate to break this to you guys, but trauma-informed care isn't really where organizations start. There's a whole other 3 phases before this. So this is trauma-aware, trauma-sensitive, trauma-responsive, and trauma-informed, which we'll talk a little bit about on the next slide. But it's actually those 4 phases, and you end up at trauma-informed. You don't start there for organizations. And then after that, it's continuous assessment of outcomes and culture and that kind of thing. So there is a model called the Missouri model of this that is very detailed and very user-friendly, and that's one of the items in the materials in the shared folder that I the link to that Google Drive folder. It's in there, and it explains kind of what an organization should be doing in each one of these phases and how you do that kind of thing. But you have to do all these things before you can even get to being trauma-informed, right? You don't just start. You have to jump into it. You have to know these things and make a concerted effort to change for organizational trauma-informed care. So the road to trauma-informed care is trauma-aware. So that means that and then again, this is organizational. So you recognize and are aware of trauma as commonplace. This is usually when you kind of assign a person to kind of be in charge of this trauma-informed journey, or you have a task force that's working on it, or a group that's working on it for your organization. Once everybody's aware of it, which is kind of the easiest of these phases, we know trauma is an issue. We want to help with trauma, ready to go. Trauma sensitive. So that's when you start building your foundational knowledge around trauma, especially if you are in an area where there's a lot of shared trauma, of whether it's an experience or poverty or cancer rates or whatever that is. You start dedicating resources to changing your culture. So that means maybe you put aside money for training. Maybe that means you bring a training in. Maybe that means that you get somebody on your staff trained in helping people learn that. Maybe you have a staff member who's dedicated to working with high-need clients. There's all kinds of dedication of resources, learning opportunities, and then you start instituting trauma-informed care processes and communication. So you start changing your written processes. You start communicating with staff about these changes. They're coming. Here's why. Here's the reasoning for that. A lot of really transparent, open communication during that period. Then you're trauma responsive. So this is kind of the pilot period, right? You're trying to put the things that you established in the trauma sensitive part, all those processes and procedures and best practices, into practice, into actual application with your clients or your volunteers or whoever your audience is, and your staff, because everybody should be receiving trauma informed support, not just clients, but everybody else. And then you're gathering feedback. There's a feedback loop during this phase where you are analyzing the data and making frequent modifications and trying to figure out what kind of the best approach is for you, for your organization. Then you graduate to trauma informed. So all the changes have been initiated, they're being monitored, changes are adopted and institutionalized at the organization. So that maybe your employee handbook changes, maybe your signage around your building changes. And there's constant assessment. Every quarter or whatever, you're looking at what's going on, you're looking at this feedback, but it is part of your organizational culture. So if someone gets a job description of an open position at your organization, it will say we are a trauma-informed organization in that job description. They know that. Maybe your employer handbook has more information about trauma in it. Maybe the way your paperwork, your intake paperwork is arranged, or your progression through your services is arranged is more trauma informed. Again, this is also in the shared link of materials. The Missouri model is in there. It is very good. It's a very great place to start. It kind of breaks the process down so it's not so overwhelming for organizations. So it's not so much, doing everything everywhere all at once. It is, here's where you start, here's where you go. This could be a years long process. And here's the other thing, you're never going to get to the end of it. Our knowledge around trauma, our knowledge around the nuances of that, or the research around trauma is changing all the time, which is why you're always checking back in with your processes, again, on a quarterly or biannual basis to make sure you're keeping up with what we know, what we learn about trauma. So there are 6 guiding principles of a trauma-informed approach. Again, because no one can always agree on everything. Some places have 5, some places have 8 principles. The most widely accepted is 6 principles, and this is what is used by the SAMHSA. So this is what I use, and I think this encapsulates it. The ones that are 8 are usually just these 6, but more specific. So you're not missing anything by not having the 8. And then the 5 usually leaves off the cultural, historical, and gender issues, which I feel are very important principles. So I use the 6 that are developed by SAMHSA. So safety. Throughout the organization, everyone needs to feel physically and psychologically safe. This is always your highest priority. Obviously, physical safety is your highest priority. Making sure people feel that they are not going to be discriminated against or judged or anything like that is a psychological safety. Making sure that within your staff or board or volunteers, there's not bullying and there's not manipulation and all that kind of stuff happening. That's the highest priority. Trustworthiness. So you have to be transparent and receptive without judgment. If you can't provide a resource, just say that. If you don't know the answer to a question, just say that. One of the other sessions I facilitate are ethics and nonprofit work, direct service work. And one of the most damaging things that we do as nonprofit professionals is not be able to say, I don't know, because we're helpers, right? We want to help people. So we want to have all the answers and be everything to everybody. That is not good for them. That is not good for us. So being able to say, I don't know the answer, or that's not my area of expertise, I'm not a therapist, is really important. Being transparent about what you can and can't do, being transparent about what resources you have and don't have, and also being receptive to whatever they're going to tell you without judgment. And sometimes you will hear some very difficult, offensive, or traumatic things, and you have to stay emotionally regulated to have that conversation with them. That's how you build that trust. That's how you build that rapport. Also, boundaries and expectations. The boundary. If you're working with a highly traumatized population, they aren't going to have boundaries. So the boundaries have to be instilled by you and reinforced by you. Clear expectations. What do they need from you? What can you provide? What is that going to look like? Do they need something that you don't have? Do you have another resource for it? Those kind of things. Peer support. Peer support is so important. Peer support is connecting traumatized people with people who have been through similar circumstances, because they can hold space for each other and collaborate and build trust and kind of also see where they're going to get, right? What's possible, this post-traumatic growth. So you don't have to do this yourself. You can have, here's a trauma survivors group that meets locally. Here are some online options. As Tammy shared, here's a TED Talk you might be interested in about post-traumatic growth. But you also should be checking in with people about this. Like for safety, you might ask them, do you feel safe here? Something I can do make you feel more safe. If you're going to have, if you have a police presence for security, explain why the police are there. We also tried to, for trustworthiness and safety, we always tried to eliminate kind of these things that are obvious they need without them having to ask. So in the bathrooms, all gender identity bathrooms had diapers of various sizes, wipes, a sign saying if you don't have the size that you need in here, come ask us, and then also sanitary napkins and tampons. That makes them feel safe. That makes them feel that they're seen, and makes them trust you, because you've already anticipated those things that a lot of people need, and we're just going to have them available. And again, peer support's the same way. Having access to help groups, providing anonymized examples of other people's journeys. I had another client who X, Y, and Z happened, and now they're doing X, Y, and Z in a confidential way, right? Anonymized. But making sure that they understand that people do get through whatever they're going through, and that you are willing to help in whatever way you can help, and also connecting with people who have gotten through that. So collaboration and mutuality. So this is partnering and leveling the power differences. So again, back to gatekeeping. People who have trauma are very sensitive to gatekeeping, where they think you're guarding all resources and they have to perform a certain way for you in order to get access to those resources. Or they ascribe you as the expert in the room. A lot of nonprofits don't think about that. They don't think about the fact that they are considered the expert by this person. So whatever you say and how you say it carries a lot of weight and sticks with them frequently. Listening comprehension can be impacted by trauma. So they may not retain everything you say, but they'll retain the parts that are important a lot of times. And sometimes you have to re-explain things later. So again, I always told people, like, I'm walking next to you in this. I'm not walking in front of you or behind you. I'm walking next to you through this journey together. And then, there's other things that you can do too that are more practical, such as being careful about, posting your degrees and awards where people can see them as certificates. That can be overwhelming for people, and again, it reinforces gatekeeping and power differential. I'm not saying people should be ashamed of their achievements. It's great that you did it, but if you're serving a traumatized population, maybe you want to keep it to 1 or 2 instead of a whole wall of all your degrees and awards and certificates and all those kind of things. We have kind of the perception that makes people feel like, oh, we are trained and eligible and capable of doing this. But to a traumatized person, that can read as, you have all the power here and I have none. They're used to that dynamic. They're comfortable with that dynamic of them having no power and you having all the power. So you have to bring that level back here and help them understand that they are a capable person who can make decisions, and you are working with them, not for them, not over them. They don't work for you, that kind of thing. Empowerment, voice, and choice. This is very important. This is the kind of the cornerstone of trauma-informed approaches. Place the person at the center of the work. They are the architect of where they go, right? And that can be scary for them. It's important not to overwhelm them. You want to give them choices, but if you say, here's all the choices in the world, they're going to shut down. That's just too much. So saying, okay, here, you want to work on this issue. Here are the top 3 options for this. Here are some consequences of each one, good, bad, or indifferent, and talk through a limited number of choices. If none of those choices work, you can start introducing other choices, but just starting, to kind of word bomb them with options is overwhelming. Making empowered decisions and critical thinking is new to a lot of people. It's important that they to be patient with them and not take over. I myself am I would be described as bossy when I was a child. They don't use that word anymore. So, I'm a helper. So I'm like, okay, you're clearly struggling. I have a plan for you. I would never say this in real life, but in my head, I got A, B, and C. I got plan C, D, and E over here. Like, let's work through it. I have to check myself to just be patient and let them learn that skill. It is more important that they learn critical thinking and decision making than me fixing their immediate problem, right? It's important that they learn to do it themselves. It's a protective factor. It protects them against future traumatization. It can reduce their current trauma. It also can protect them against violence in the future. Critical thinking and decision making. So you have to be patient, empower them to make choices, reinforce your confidence in them to make these choices and to do well for themselves. Cultural circle and gender issues. Again, ensure that your written communications have neutral language. Build a network of resources that specialize in different populations. So if someone says, hey, I'd really like to find a therapist that is also LGBTQ, you can say, okay, here's who we have. Are you going to be able to cover everything for everybody? No, but trying to be intentional in building a diverse network of resources you can help. The other thing is and this one's a little touchy, be mindful of your own bias, right? You're not going to be culturally competent with anybody else's experience. You may have humility for it, but you might have knowledge about it, but you haven't experienced it. You haven't lived under that mantle of whatever this is. So be aware of that. Don't try to hijack their experience. Don't try to talk them out of their experience. Don't put the burden on them of having to explain why something happened and why it upset them. It's enough that they said this, I was upset because this happened. You don't have to say, oh, why is that? That's not useful. Accept constructive feedback about anything that might show bias. So if a colleague or a client says, hey, you said that, I think it sounded a little bit racist, or I think that was sexist, or I don't think you understand what that word, the connotations that word has, our immediate response, totally normal response, is to be defensive. I am not racist. I am not sexist. You can't blame me because I didn't know. All of that might be true, but saying, oh, I could taking a minute to say, oh, I could see where that sounds racist, or that sounds sexist, or I had no idea that was the word that was used, and apologizing if needed, but absorbing that feedback. The other thing is being able to gracefully and constructively receive feedback is a great thing to model for your clients and for your colleagues, right? That's how we all learn. That's how we get accountability. That's how things start happening. Obviously, if they're accusing them that's just patently untrue, that's a different situation. But a lot of times with cultural, historical, and gender stuff, there's probably a grain of truth in there. We just have to be able to hear it and adopt whatever we need changes, or think about whatever changes that might be necessary for it. We're not perfect. We're not going to be perfect. We just have to work and be the best that we can and be accountable for our own stuff. So organizational trauma-informed care is absolutely important, but individuals such as yourself and myself are the most important element of this, right? Because they're the ones who are delivering it. They're the ones who are going to be the nuts and bolts of this operation. They're going to also inform how your organizational trauma-informed care works and succeeds. So it's important that you understand your own stress level triggers and are emotionally regulated before you interact and react with others. If you are in a high stress state, if you have recently been triggered, if you are just very dysregulated that day for whatever reason, maybe you try to figure out a way that you can reschedule your appointments, or somebody else can talk to them, or you just let the person know, hey, I am also struggling today. So I didn't want to have to delay your appointment. But please know that I'm also struggling today. It's fine for you to share that. You have to share all the reasons. That's inappropriate. That's a boundary. But just saying I'm struggling, or I'm moving a little bit slow today is fine for you to say. Ideally, you'd be able not to just take a break from direct service in a day, but that's not always possible. So just being honest with yourself. Focus on what's behind the other person's interactions. They're likely responding to something that has absolutely 100% nothing to do with you. But you are a safe target, right? You are reasonably objective to their life, most likely. You obviously want to help them. That's your job. So they know that. So try not to take it personal. And it feels very personal. And I understand that. It can feel very, very personal. But again, taking that moment to say, something bad has happened to this person before they ever walk through my door. Maybe lots of something bad has happened to this person, and they're reacting to that. They're not reacting to me. I have created a safe place for them to have this reaction, and my job is to support them while they have it. If the person is emotionally dysregulated, wait for them to return to a regulated state. So if they come in and they are already triggered when they show up, they're in the middle of trauma when they show up, or something happens while they're there and they're triggered and become very, emotional, upset, crying, angry, walking around, try to just kind of take a moment and say, do we need 5 minutes or something I can make you more comfortable? We'll talk about that in a minute. And wait for them to return to that kind of more regulated state. If that's not going to be possible, do not try to continue working on like concrete things with them. Don't have them sign papers for court. Don't have them fill out applications for housing. Don't have them answer your endless demographic questions. Stop all of that and just talk to them as a person. Build a rapport, learn more about their responses. That's going to help you working with that client long term more than getting all your demographic information in that moment. Seeing it as a person who's struggling and just saying, hey, let's talk about whatever's happening to you, how you're feeling, helping them ground and focus. Let's talk about 3 things you hear right now, 3 things you can see right now, 3 parts of your body, anything that pulls their focus away from their trigger. Obviously, if you feel unsafe, that's different. If you're feeling physically unsafe, or if this person seems to be in a state that they need immediate intervention, that's different. But on the average, just stopping the formal work and getting to build rapport with them while they're dysregulated is going to go a long way. Trauma survivors are absolutely masters of other people's moods, actions, and nonverbal communication. And here's the deal. Your nonverbal signals account for 93% of communication. That's your tone, that's your facial expression, that's your body language. That's, if you're staring at a computer typing while they're over here telling you their story, that's nonverbal communication. If you're sighing, or if you're crying with them, like these are all things that are nonverbal, and what you're saying may be different than what you're displaying. Trauma survivors focus more on what you're displaying as opposed to what you're saying. So it's important that you pay attention to all of that, and be present with them, and arrange your space in a way that is comfortable for everybody, and making sure that your nonverbal communication conveys what your verbal communication is saying. And again, being able to take feedback on that. For a colleague to be able to say, hey, in that meeting, you came across really aggressive, or you seemed, completely disconnected, you weren't paying attention. Instead of that immediate defensive,ness, take 3 seconds to be like, yeah, I probably was disconnected. And you can just say, thank you for letting me know it was noticeable. And, and I will work on what caused that to happen, or something like that effect. There's no need to be defensive. It's hard. It's very hard. I'm not going to tell you that all that I am just super zen. If my husband could hear me even say that, he would laugh. I'm very type A. I'm very, regimented in that way. But I've learned that being defensive doesn't help me grow. It prevents growth. So trying to really hear constructive feedback. And if it's not constructive feedback, just take it and let it go, which again is hard to do, especially if you're a person that has a generalized anxiety disorder. You may ruminate on that. But arguing with somebody or being defensive in most cases is not going to help anyone. Not helps them. It doesn't help you. It's a waste of energy. We all only have so much energy to give. So it's important that we recognize where that comes into play. So for an individual, so your organization is working through the Missouri model and they're doing great, but as an individual, you can get started tomorrow with trauma-informed care. You can do it on your own. In your personal life, you can do this, also in your professional life. So one of the most basic things you can do to be more trauma-informed is evaluate the space for which you are responsible. And as a caveat, your space might be a website, it might be an office, it might be a van, it might be a food truck, it could be anywhere. So space is just where you meet people, right? It doesn't have to be an actual space. It could be a virtual space. It could be wherever. Is the space organized and tidy? This one usually in person gets a lot of chuckles because not everyone is organized and tidy, and that is totally fine. Your space should reflect, your personality as well. But clutter and disarray can be very triggering for people. So even if you have a lot of stuff, if it's organized, not falling off of shelves or whatever, you can make it tidy, even if there's a lot of stuff there. There is, that also increases trustworthiness. If you have just a stack of files that are falling over and you're trying to, sort through your paperwork and you don't have don't know where your laptop plug is, that makes the other person feel like maybe this person doesn't know what they're doing. It starts to make them question your ability to help them a little bit. Is your paint and decor soothing and non-intrusive? Little known fact, there are actually trauma-informed paint schemes that research has shown visually they are soothing, visually they can reduce chaos, visually they can reduce outbursts and trauma reactions. If you go to any kind of like a therapist's office, a lot of times they are the same kind of colors as neutral colors, blues, those kind of thing. And conversely, a lot of people are like, well, I want my office or space or whatever to be bright, and we have all these kind of primary colors, and that's fine, but that's not a soothing environment visually, especially if you're serving traumatized populations. Also, if you have things that make noise or blink or have anything, one of those fountain deals like that have water in them, ask the person, hey, is the water okay to be on my fountain? Is that too much for you? Anything like that, to just look at your space. Is it arranged to encourage interaction? Again, you have to respect people's boundaries, like physical boundaries, but you don't want to have a space where it's you looking at a computer and a person sitting next to you talking to you. Right? So is it 2 chairs? Is it I can write this down and then put it in my computer later? Trust and believe, I have worked under government grants for almost 15 years. I know the level of data that's required to collect, but also I know that people are more important. So you can say, hey, I need to collect this information. Do you want to fill this out? Do you want me to collect it from you? Give them some options about how that gets done and why you're doing it. Do you have any personal items on display that might suggest a bias to others? So this one's a little touchy. People don't like, don't like this one so much. But anything that is like a political sign, for a candidate or for an issue that's too for or against or whatever, that can be suggest a bias. Religious affiliations can suggest a bias. Certificates, diplomas, awards, we talked about all of that, like anything that's seen as gatekeeping or classist or whatever. But if somebody happens to be, say they are a Christian, they come into your office and you have an Israeli flag hanging up, that might be something they perceive as bias. So being very thoughtful, again, about what you put in your office. And I'm not saying that you can't have your personal items on display. I'm just saying, think about the amount of personal items you have and what it says to the people who come into your office. So just kind of think through that. Do you have any informational signage or material that's out of date? As nonprofit professionals, we are so bad about sticking up a flyer for this group that's starting in May, and now it's almost August, and we still have that up there. So just kind of looking around. When I worked in a organization, I actually once a month I had a half an hour on my calendar blocked out to just look around my office to see if I had anything that was outdated, anything that's got kind of wonky, anything that makes noise, anything that blinks, anything that might be funny to me without funny to other people, that kind of thing. And is your relevant information clearly, succinctly conveyed on signage or materials? So examples of this are if you have costs associated with your organization, is that posted somewhere clearly and succinctly? One of the things that we always did that I instituted at my previous employer was everybody had mandatory reporting signs in both English and Spanish. Every office, whether they were direct service, the executive director had it on their door, our development people had it on their door, the front doors had it, the bathrooms had it. Because in Indiana, everyone is mandatory reporters. So if we suspect child abuse or neglect, we have to report it. So we had a little paragraph, I think it was 2 sentences statement that said, everything here is confidential except in these instances. And then we have to call for help. And that alleviates that gray area, right? It's very upfront, it's very transparent. It feels very transparent to people who are in your organization. Anything else about, like, if there's a background check or if there's going to be drug testing, I don't know what you all do, it should be clearly displayed and shared in understandable terms, not flowery language, very basic, succinct terms. If you have a lot of Spanish speakers or Chinese Mandarin speakers or anything like that, make sure that the languages are available as well. Also, make sure whatever documents that you have to hand out, materials that you give information, that all the websites are working, all the phone numbers are correct, all of the dates are correct, all the addresses are correct. Again, on my calendar once a month, the other day that I wasn't doing my office, I would go through what I had in my information packet, click on all the links, call all the numbers, make sure it's all correct. What you are giving them is given a lot of weight, so it needs to be accurate and successful. Also, people who are traumatized have a low tolerance for any kind of frustration. So if they call a number to get signed up for counseling and that number's been disconnected, they're done. They shut down. They're not going to do it. If they click on a website that's broken, same thing. That's a barrier. They have low tolerance for that. So language is one of the most powerful tools in adopting a more trauma-informed approach across the board: work, social, personal, professional, romantic, all the things. But here's what you can do. Always introduce yourself to others and briefly explain your role. This might be your professional role, or it could be your role at the school board, or it could be your, who you are to the person that brought you to the party. Always introduce yourself and explain your role. It makes it easier for other people. Allow the other person to introduce themselves and provide any additional information they wish. This sounds odd, but I put it in here because it is a very Midwestern thing. Avoid making comments about their physical appearance. So somebody will say, "Hi, I'm Jenny, and I'm here because I need some housing." And then I say, "Oh, that's such, your hair looks so pretty. Great to meet you." Or, "I love your purse," or "That's such a pretty name," or anything like that. Like, you want to compliment people and be like, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here," or whatever. But like, if you comment on their name, their appearance, their clothing, that could be a trigger for them. There's a larger reason that it could be inappropriate, but it also could be a trigger for them. They could be very self-conscious about their appearance. They could have body dysmorphia, all of which are very common with the survivors. Any comments about their clothing or purse, if they have trauma related to poverty or insecurity, that could be perceived as you being like denigrating, like you're making fun of them. So it's important just to keep whatever compliments you have about who they are. It's great that you're here. I'm so glad to meet you. I've been looking forward to this, or whatever is appropriate. Listen more than you talk. Again, this is a struggle for me. Obviously, from the last 2.5 hours, I like to talk, but it's their time. It's their time, right? So it can be also, again, we are helpers, so we are going to try to fill that silence with all the time that we can use to get the help where they need to be. Resist that urge, right? If they're going to sit in silence, you can say, "Hey, should we just, do you just want to get comfortable here, and you can let me know when you're ready to talk?" Okay. Or you can ask questions that aren't going to require a long answer, like, "Did you find our building okay? Do you need some water?" Like those kind of things to get them more at ease with you. But don't try to just kind of badger them with information. And it's hard, again, because we have to collect 14 tons of data. But again, you also are going to have a chance to get that data later. Assure the other person that they are in control of their time with you, and you're going to take your cues from them. Again, you have to be careful not to overwhelm them. You can't just say, "Oh, this is your time, tell me what you need." But you can say, when you called in, you said you needed X, Y, and Z. Is that still what you're looking for today? Do you have a top priority of what you want to do today? Do you just want to meet me today? And just kind of give them, again, not plethora of choices, but just a couple choices, and let them know that they are in charge of the time. Be compassionate and consistent with your boundaries. Boundaries are hard for people with trauma. They're hard to set and they're hard to respect. So you have to be the person that's consistent with, "Oh, no, our time is up. You need to go." You don't say it that way, but our time is up. Let's make sure we have our next appointment on the schedule. Or if they're late, more than 15 minutes late, you can say, "I'm sorry, you're late, and I don't have time on my calendar to see you, but let's get this scheduled, or we can meet by phone," or whatever the situation is. Things happen outside of trauma. Things happen. People are going to be late. People miss their appointments. But the boundaries are really important. That also reduces the risk of bias if you're treating everybody the same. Everybody has the same boundaries around basic behavior, around showing up, around whatever those things are at your organization that you've decided are important. This last thing, people do not, absolutely 100% do not owe you an explanation of their trauma. They don't. We know trauma is universal. Not every person wants to share their experience with you. You don't need every detail. Honor their choice, right? Obviously, there are exceptions to this. If you are a clinical provider, if you are in a medical setting, if, for instance, you're filling out a protective order and you do need details because you have to have them for the order, the story is typically not owed, but you can explain why you need to know. And they can still choose not to tell you, but it's not owed. But otherwise, and if you don't need to know, don't ask. They'll share if they want to. And again, this is hard because I'm one of those people that wants to know everything about everybody, get down to the details and figure it out, right? So when I was early on in my career, I had to learn this skill. I had a boss who literally called me on it. You can't ask all these questions. And I'm like, well, I'm just trying to build a rapport and engage with them. Okay, fine, but there's better ways to do it. There are better ways to do it than exploring every nuance of every bad thing that's happened to them. So letting them tell you what they want to tell you about their past trauma while you work on the here and now. You can show empathy, you can show compassion, you can even show, some sort of camaraderie around it if you had a similar experience within reason. But you shouldn't say, okay, oh yeah, that sounds really interesting, tell me more. Let them talk how they want to talk. Usually over time, they will share what they're going to share, especially true also in your personal relationships. Probing too hard and too much feels like they're being attacked a lot of times, so you have to be very sensitive to that. Again, language. So there are trauma invalidated, things that you might say, and there's a way to say it in trauma validated ways. It was so long ago. I believe you, right? So I'm not going to go through the whole chart. But these are some things on the left that in some way you'll hear, and on the right, responses that you can have. Obviously, you're going to adjust the responses to be in your own vernacular and your own cadence of speaking, but these are some just to get you thinking about the way we say things and how they're heard and how you might say things differently. Also in the linked materials folder is something called an emotional vocabulary wheel. So it has two purposes. One, if in the middle will have the emotion and it feeds out to words associated with that emotion, it'll help you learn how to talk about those emotions in ways that maybe aren't so direct or in ways that are a little more gentle to the person. It will also help you hear what they're saying and be able to interpret it back to an emotion. So if they're saying a word that you think seems an odd way to describe how they're feeling, this wheel might be able to connect it back to, oh, they are upset, oh, they are disgusted, oh, they are happy, oh, they are sad. So that's in there, and it's a really useful tool. I actually used to keep my, it was an older version, this is a newer version, on my desk, like on my blotter on my desk, so I could see it sitting there and be able to glance down and start to learn those words, how I spoke and how I heard things. It was really helpful, especially in the beginning of doing trauma-informed care. How to support someone who has experienced trauma. Again, I'm not going to read through all of these little nuances, but predictability. Don't throw a surprise party for a trauma survivor. Actually, I wouldn't like a surprise party either, but it needs to be reasonably the same. Your appointments need to be reasonably the same. If they're going to have to meet with somebody else because you are on medical leave, they need to know that before they just show up and somebody else is there, if it's possible. Obviously, it's an emergency. It is what it is. But if you know you're going to be gone on vacation and they're going to meet with so-and-so instead of you, let them know that. And if they don't want to, you can say, okay, you can see me when I come back. Again, space and perspective, right? This is not about you. It's not about anything you've done. It feels personal, but it's not. Give them space. Give them the ability to react how they're going to react and respond how they're going to respond. Take responsibility for what's yours, but not what's not yours. And you can do that. Recalibration. So again, we have, especially when we're talking to people, stop you're overreacting, you're oversensitive, you're over whatever. Because when you say that, you're telling this person, here's where we all are and here's where you are. And that makes them feel isolated, and it makes them feel different, and it makes them feel ashamed, right? Don't refer to person's upbringing, problem, or issues or behavior. Don't talk around it. Call it trauma if you can. If they say, please don't call it trauma, don't call it trauma. But if you can say, hey, I think, the issues with your upbringing, that doesn't give them a powerful word to use. Saying the trauma of the way you were raised, or the trauma you experienced as a child, or the trauma of your divorce, or the trauma of that assault, gives them a word. And you don't have to belabor it, you don't have to get into it, but just giving them that word, introducing that word is very powerful for a lot of people. Some people are very sensitive to that word. It doesn't happen very often, but occasionally it's somebody who say, don't call it trauma. Okay, we won't call it trauma. Listening, empathy, and empowerment, be supportive. You have to set limits. But making sure they have a choice, that's the biggest thing. And choice in everything. Make sure they know they have a choice to leave whenever they want to leave. You're not keeping them there. Make sure that they have a choice of, if we want to take a break, if we don't want to take a break, all that kind of stuff. But just making sure that you keep these things in mind. And again, this is a great thing to print off and have for you to look at, just to remind you of what's happening. Self-awareness. No one is immune to trauma, including all of you and me and everybody else. A lot of people, again, go into nonprofit or social work as a response to their own past trauma. The majority of people I know who are executive directors started their organizations because of response to their own trauma or secondary trauma. So it's important that you identify and respond to your own trauma before you start working with others. You don't have to have it all figured out and all resolved, but you should at least be aware of your own trauma and triggers and trying to be the most regulated version of yourself before you start meeting with people who are also dysregulated. You should never sacrifice your own healing and well-being to help others. It's one of those put your mask on before you help anybody else situations in the airplane, right? You have to be okay with yourself, and you have to be in a place where you are either working through your trauma or have resolved your trauma in order to do this with other people. Here's my real talk moment again. There are always going to be people that you cannot help. Full stop. This is hard for us to accept. It's hard to say, but it's true. You have to know your limits, and you have to make peace with that fact. You cannot help every person. You can't save every person. That's just the reality. Some people might pose a risk to your and other safety. Your safety is paramount. So if this person is threatening and this person is violent, you aren't the right organization to help them. Not every person wants to be helped, and they have a right to change their mind about receiving help at any point. There are too many people in the world who want your help and need your help to spend your time trying to convince somebody to let you help them, right? Their healing begins with autonomy and self-directed choices. And sometimes their self-directed choice is not to work with you. It's not personal. That's just what their choice is. Sometimes your resources are not enough and someone needs more help than you can safely provide. Again, this might be outside of your scope of understanding or training, lack of funding, inability to address the unique circumstances. If they have, for instance, an undiagnosed mental health issue, maybe they have signs of a bipolar disorder or something like that, and you are not a mental health facility, you can provide resources for them. Here's who we have in our community, but you cannot substitute for that. You cannot substitute for addiction treatment or medical treatment, or if they have a highly specialized need and you can't meet that need, just be honest and transparent. We can't meet this need. We've tried to find alternate resources, we can't find them, and they'll be upset, but it's better to be transparent than to give services that aren't appropriate. Their choices are their own, and you have no control over their decisions or consequences. Removing their agency or asserting your own agency over them compounds their trauma. It doesn't benefit anybody. It's exhausting for you, and it is upsetting to them. So please, they are people. Even if we think they're making all the wrong choices that are dangerous, they're their choices to make, and we can't assert dominance over that. Some people will trigger your own trauma. It's not through any fault of their own. You can't control your triggers more than anybody else can. So if someone comes in and maybe their voice sounds similar to somebody else, or you know them, you know them from high school or college or whatever, or for whatever reason you're just not comfortable with them, make sure they get the help they need, but it doesn't have to be you that provides it. If you're uncomfortable the whole time you're serving them, it's not going to be useful for them. So the bottom line of all of this is that trauma doesn't have to define a person. Trying to talk people out of their trauma. Here on the left, you have some different validity statements. We a lot of times try to talk people out of trauma because if we can talk them out of it, it means that A, we don't have to deal with the fallout from it, and B, we can just go back to thinking they're out of control person or whatever, and C, we don't have to consider our role in their trauma and support in recovery. That's easier. healing from trauma for the most part, not for everybody, but for the most part, is possible and happens when the people are ready, when people are ready to help receive that, and if they have the ability to access those services. Mental health, as you know, is very not equally distributed here in the United States. So trying to find those services and help them when they're ready for it. It's not linear. You go forward, you go back, you go up, you go down. But it's important that they know that people do get through it and that people can recover and even grow from it. But again, not in a way that implies they deserved it, but that when they are ready to start that journey, here are some resources that can help, have those on hand and ready to go. Same thing goes for you. If you are a traumatized person or you're watching this thinking it describes a lot of you and you've never sat down to sit with that and look through it, there are absolutely resources available that can help you. And if you're not ready for that, that's fine too. But just being aware is kind of the first step of what you're going to do next or what you can help clients decide to do next. And here's my kind of, ending moment of, we don't have all the credentials to help people address their trauma. It's unfortunate that we don't, but what we all do have is the ability to help people on their journey and help them feel valid, seen, and respected. A lot of people with trauma, especially complex trauma, are used to being avoided. They're used to being seen as a problem to deal with. They're used to being rejected. And so we have the ability, even if we can't help them, to still make them feel valid and seen and respected. And most of all, we all have the ability to choose, it's a choice, to see others in the wonderfully complex totality of their existence and show them compassion. No one is the best or worst parts of themselves. Everyone is struggling with something. Everyone is great at something. Everyone is, learning things all the time. And that's hopefully why you do the work that you do, is because you believe in people, you believe in humanity, and you believe in compassion. And that's really what trauma-informed care is at its core, is treating people, as a total complex, mystifying journey and showing them compassion and seeing them and respecting them anyway. Trauma is healed through safe relationships. And, relationships a lot of times get kind of pigeonholed into like a romantic relationship. That's not what I mean. It can be parent-child, it can be friends, it can be neighbors, it can be client advocate, it can be, two volunteers at the same place. It could be anywhere. A safe relationship is a safe relationship. So I really encourage you to think about how you conduct yourself in a way that honors people's complexity and your own complexity and celebrates that, as opposed to trying to kind of get everybody in a box, right? So, all right, you made it. What questions, comments, or thoughts do you have? Also, given the nature of this topic, you can send questions to me privately at, there's my email. The person who messaged me about wanting some resources about training, if you want to send me an email at this email address here, and let me know what you're looking for, I am happy to send you what I have and get you started on that journey. But does anybody else have any questions? You can also come off of mute if you want to and ask, or you can drop them in the chat, or comments or thoughts. Oh, thank you, Patricia. I was wondering how it would go with the virtual side of things, but I appreciate that. It's been interesting to do it, but I'm glad that we could do it and get some great feedback and get some great participation. So, does anybody else have any questions? This is, again, my email, my LinkedIn. Thank you all for being awesome. I hope you have a great day. I hope you stay safe. And again, this recording will be up. My email will be in the shared link. I will put the link in here one more time for anyone who joined late, because you will be able to go back and see it. That has my slides, and that has the supporting materials for it. So again, if you guys think of something, thank you guys so very much. If you guys think of, let me stop sharing. if you guys think of anything else that you might need or anything else that questions you have or follow up or whatever, just please shoot me an email. I'm happy to talk. Again, I will talk to anybody about anything. So please feel free to reach out to me and let me know. And otherwise, May and Judy, do you guys need anything before we go?
May had to
a
step away
recent-
for a few minutes. She's had a lot of flooding going on. So on her behalf, I would just like to thank you, Jennifer, and I want to thank all of you for participating in this. If you have questions, as Jennifer said, you contact her. You can contact any of us at Sparkwood Mountain Association. And just thank you for the wonderful work that y'all are doing.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Go get some lunch and have a good day.